If Hollywood ever told the true story of the Spanish conquest of the Aztec, it would be the greatest action movie of all time. The following events that we're about to cover are described by both the Spanish and the Aztec themselves. This is the true story of Hernán Cortés and the Spanish conquest of Mexico. Viewer discretion is advised. The decade before the conquest, the Spaniards had enslaved the entire population on the island of Hispaniola. Holy men who ended up being whistleblowers to the crown reported seeing natives being tortured with dog attacks, having their arms cut off. One friar even described a scene where there was a mass burning of Native Americans, like a ritualistic burning that was used to intimidate the population. The treatment was so horrible that the crown even made new laws that tried to prevent the indiscriminate killing and torturing of Native Americans. Enforcement of those laws would prove to be very difficult so far away. Hernán Cortés is the main character in today's episode, and he might have been the sharpest of all conquistadors. In the book Conquistador Voices, they describe him as dangerously intelligent, persuasive, and bold, never waiting for permission, only seizing whatever opportunities came his way. As a teenager in Spain, Cortés became obsessed with tales of the Indies. At just 19 years old in 1504, he set sail for Hispaniola to start a new life. Within a few short years, he owned land, enslaved natives, and had already begun climbing the social ladder. An opportunity to colonize Cuba presented itself, and after a quick conquest and pacification of the natives that lived there, Cortés found himself with even more Native American slaves, land, and gold. A slave hunting expedition heading west from Cuba would soon change everything. It was 1517 and the conquistadors were still blind to the true scale of the world around them. Florida was thought to be just another island. No one yet realized the wealthy civilization waiting on the mainland. That year, Francisco de Cordoba led a small fleet into unknown waters. They landed on the coast of the Yucatan, and what they found was nothing like the island tribes that they were used to fighting. Here, the Spaniards faced warriors who lived in stone temples and towering monuments. These were the remnants of the Maya civilization, but still powerful enough to fight the small Spanish expedition. The battles were brutal. The Spanish suffered many losses, and Cordoba himself was mortally wounded, dying soon after the return. When the survivors limped back to Cuba, they brought one major revelation. The natives had gold. The secret was out. In 1518, 4 ships and 250 men, led by Juan de Grijalva, a 29-year-old captain hoping to trade with the natives, returned to the same coast where Cordoba had been killed, and this time managed to push back the defenders. From there, they sailed north along the shores, eventually reaching the mouth of the Grijalva River in what is now Tabasco. I visited these shores to capture this drone footage. This is the exact location they landed. Just off the beach was a mural of a Spanish ship representing what could have been seen from the shore over 500 years prior. I then proceeded to drink coconuts and eat tacos on the beach, and subsequently got the worst food poisoning I've ever had in my life. Instead of a battle, the Spaniards opened up a dialogue and traded peacefully with the locals, who spoke of a powerful ruler far inland named Montezuma, and of a kingdom overflowing with riches. Continuing along the coast, they reached the modern-day Veracruz. Smoke was rising from a nearby island, and when the Spaniards landed, they found stone temples covered in idols. Upon entrance, they noticed the walls were smeared with blood from a sacrifice that had taken place the night before. Bodies lay mutilated, hearts torn out, arms hacked away. They named this place the Island of Sacrifices. The following day, they saw 4 priests, their hair stiff with dried blood. The Spaniards claimed they even witnessed a ritual where 2 boys were sacrificed, chests opened while they were still alive. Horrified and running low on supplies, Grijalva's men turned back to Cuba. This would not be the last time the Spanish would be on this island. But they didn't return empty-handed. They carried news of gold, strange gods, and the name of a king who would soon dominate Spain's ambitions, Montezuma. Fast forward 1 year later, Hernán Cortés is drowning in debt, living a lavish lifestyle far beyond his means. He was desperate for a chance to lead an expedition to the new lands. Officially, conquest had to be approved by the crown, but for slave expeditions or scouting expeditions or even trading, you could get that approved by the governor in Cuba. So the governor reluctantly gave Cortés permission to go and scout and trade. But Cortés wasn't the type to settle for half measures. He immediately started recruiting soldiers, stockpiling weapons, and building a fleet that looked more like an army of conquest rather than a group of traders. He wasn't coming to barter, he was coming for everything. Cortés wanted the entire empire. When the governor realized what Cortés was planning to do, he sent out men to arrest him. Cortés successfully recruited many of these men to join his ranks, and the rest he subdued. Before another attempt could be made to stop him, Cortés set sail with 500 men and a handful of ships. It was all or nothing. Success would make him one of the most powerful and rich men in the world. Failure would almost certainly lead to jail time and possibly even death. They made their way to the island of Cozumel and were astonished by the Maya that were there. Soon Cortés started hearing natives saying, "Castellan, Castellan," and he inquired about this and was shocked to discover that 2 Spaniards were living among the Maya that had been cast away there a decade before, and they had been enslaved by the Maya ever since. Cortés sent men to track them down, and when they finally found one, he was unrecognizable. Dressed like a native, marked by years of hard labor, fully absorbed into Maya life. His name was Geronimo de Aguilar, and we'll refer to him as Aguilar throughout the rest of the story. 8 years earlier, he had survived a shipwreck that killed everyone else except for one other Spaniard. That survivor's name was Gonzalo Guerrero, but unlike Aguilar, Guerrero refused to return. It was Guerrero who had helped organize the original ambush that killed Captain Cordoba years earlier. Aguilar joined Cortés, and since he was fluent in both Maya and Spanish, this unlocked a gateway that would really help with diplomacy, and especially for Cortés to communicate his psychological warfare that he was about to enable on the native population. Cortés moved his fleet north to the Grijalva River, where I'd shown you the drone shot earlier that I had taken. The last time the Spanish had landed here, they traded peacefully with the locals. But this time, it was war. Thousands of native warriors were already waiting on the beach, outnumbering the Spaniards many times over. Cortés didn't hesitate. He split his forces, sending boats further up the coast, making sure to strike from behind while the main force attacked from the front. What followed was a massacre. The natives had never faced these crossbows, muskets, cavalry, or cannons. They'd never even seen a horse before. Imagine never hearing a cannon before, and then all of a sudden the ground shakes, thunder splits the air, and men around you are torn in half. The shock alone was as devastating as the weapons themselves. By the end, the battlefield was littered with bodies. Over 800 natives lay dead. The chronicler Bernal Diaz describes the scene. "When it was over, we pressed rags over our wounds, for that was all we had. The horses' wounds were seared shut, then treated with fat from a dead Indian that we had cut open for that purpose. We counted more than 800 bodies, most stabbed. Wherever the horsemen had gone, the dead were piled high." After this bloody victory at Grijalva, Cortés made it official. He proclaimed the land conquered in the name of King Charles. It was a bold move, and one that would put him in direct defiance of the governor back in Cuba. No conquest had ever been approved. The very next day, a delegation of natives arrived seeking peace and asking permission to bury their dead. For Cortés, this was the perfect chance to demonstrate some of his psychological warfare. He believed that the natives thought the cannons and horses were divine beings, and that the Spaniards were just servants. To play into that fear, Cortés staged this spectacle. He tied a mare in heat to a tree, then brought over a stallion to stir chaos. As the delegation gathered, he warned them that both the horses and cannons were very angry. If they resisted, this god would unleash its fury. Right on cue, a cannon blasts, shattering a nearby tree. All of the natives were stunned, and the message worked. The next day, they returned with gifts, including more than 20 women. Among them, one who would change everything, La Malinche. She was born near the Mayalands, but was raised to speak Nahuatl, so she was fluent in both. La Malinche could now translate Nahuatl to Mayan, and then from Mayan, Aguilar could translate that to Spanish to Cortés, and this opened up everything. From that moment forward, La Malinche and Aguilar were always at Cortés's hip. When word of Cortés reached the Aztec capital, Montezuma was reportedly fearful and stunned. According to both the Aztec and the Spanish chronicles, Montezuma was obsessed with this cycle of return, in particular the return of Quetzalcoatl. And it's this 52-year cycle, and supposedly part of the legend is that white men with beards would show up in 1519, the same year that they did, and rule over the land. And these white men were gods. But many make the argument that the blend of the white beards and the gods coming from the east was maybe added afterwards as a way to pacify the populations and make the Spanish's appearance feel like destiny. To appease these strangers, Montezuma sent gifts and even dispatched his best painters to capture the newcomers, their ships, cannons, and horses. Cortés allowed it and even struck a pose for these portraits, but before the artists left, he staged another show of power. From the Aztec accounts of the meetings, Cortés handed Montezuma's messengers spears and declared, "I've heard that Aztecs are great warriors, At dawn, 2 of yours will face 2 of us, so I can see for myself. Prepare yourself." The Aztec very quickly got out of there and retreated back to their capital city. According to the Aztec accounts, Montezuma ordered 2 captives to be sacrificed before the messengers, their hearts ripped out, their blood sprinkled over them, and then he demanded a full report of everything they had witnessed. When he heard of the Spaniards' horses, the messengers described that Montezuma was shaken. Convinced it might be the return of Quetzalcoatl, he ordered more gifts, food, jewelry, and even 2 captives to be sacrificed, just in case the Spanish wanted to drink their blood. They refused the food that they had brought with them because they had sprinkled blood on it, and what took place afterwards was a bit of an awkward meeting, where it's described that the Aztec priests started trying to do dark magic on the Spanish, but to no avail, which really intimidated them. A new opportunity presented itself when the simple Wallans started complaining about their treatment they were receiving from the Aztec and their tax collectors. Cortés seized the moment, and when the Aztec tax collectors arrived, he had them arrested and declared that the simple Wallans and the rest of the tribes in the area no longer had to serve Montezuma, but now served the King of Spain. The sneaky Cortés was also telling the Aztec captives that he was on their side, and that he would soon free them to return safely to Montezuma, and he would like to meet His Excellence. Meanwhile, the Spanish and the natives built the first official settlement, Villarrica de la Veracruz, and overnight Cortés cut ties with the governor of Cuba and claimed direct authority from the King of Spain himself. If he failed, he would surely be hung at this point. But not everybody was down with this. Many of his men protested and asked to be taken back to Cuba. At this point, there was enough gold for Cortés to send back a royal fifth and really make the money talk so he could get what he wanted, permission to continue forward, and really, he was going to continue no matter what. It was more so to protect him when all of this ended. A plot was uncovered by some rebels that thought that they were being held against their will, and they planned to steal a ship and sail back to Cuba. Cortés ordered a punishment of 200 lashings for each of them, and then he burned the ships, making sure that no one was leaving this conquest. They started marching to the mountains, and this was described as a very brutal trip. They had been used to the low, hot, humid beaches, and now they were going to the arid, gigantic 18,000 feet mountains and volcanoes that they had never even seen before. They were running out of food and had nothing but their armor to sleep in at night in the cold mountains. They eventually reached Zacatlan, where they got food, got the nourishment they needed, and the rest. It was here that Bernal Diaz described them counting 100,000 skulls piled up in the plazas, all put together with mortar. The Spanish eventually run into the Tlaxcaltecas, who were independent and fierce enemies of the Aztec. Under stress, Cortés made the mistake to attack and soon found himself ambushed by over 40,000 natives, who killed one of their horses, proving that these beasts were mortal. The Spanish had a large advantage with their armor, and eventually caused enough devastation during the battle that the Tlaxcalteca retreated, but the natives were not having it. They gathered 40,000 men, striking terror into many of the soldiers who were already regretting their presence in this strange land. In Kevin Siepel's book, Conquistador Voices, he describes a scene where men were lined up to see the priests for confession, as they were certain they were about to die. Cortés and many of the soldiers were suffering from fever, and it was really looking like this was going to be the end for the Spanish. Meanwhile, La Malinche is taking her own agency in being a diplomat between the two groups, constantly negotiating. The Tlaxcalteca had her tell the Spanish that they were going to eat their flesh with chilies. The Spanish sent back a message giving them 2 days to surrender and join their force, or they would kill them all. Eventually, cooler heads prevailed, and they decided they had one common goal: to take down Montezuma. Many of Cortés's men started begging him to take this opportunity to turn around and go back to Cuba. They all almost died. How could he even think about pressing his luck with the almighty Aztec? Cortés, of course, ignored all of this, reaffirming to them that they were the bravest Spaniards to ever live, and ordered everyone to prepare for the next leg of their march. With the Tlaxcalteca joining Cortés's ranks, Montezuma scrambled to stop the march, sending Cortés and his men gifts and asking what contribution their royal lords would require from the Aztec, adding that he would gladly pay it as long as the Spaniards agreed to turn around. They would regroup for several months in the now peaceful Tlaxcalteca capital. They described a scene where they were greeted by tens of thousands of natives, all on top of their buildings, with a very welcoming and festive attitude toward the Spaniards. But even here, Diaz describes more grisly scenes of human sacrifice. "We found wooden cages full of Indians, both male and female, being fattened up until they were ready to be sacrificed and eaten. We broke open and destroyed these cages and let the prisoners go. Cortés expressed his great displeasure with the caciques of Tlaxcala. They turned and promised to not kill or eat any more Indians. However, their promises had little value, since they returned to their old ways as soon as we turned our heads. During this time, Cortés is getting intelligence on the Aztec and found out that they had 150,000 warriors ready to fight the conquistadors. Only 20 miles away was Cholula, who was the sworn enemies of the Tlaxcalteca, and by October of that year, the Spaniards and 1,000 of their native allies marched toward Cholula. The natives were asked to stay outside the city since they were sworn enemies, but the Spaniards went ahead to go greet the Cholulan cacique. This scene was described by Alonso Aguilar. As we were entering the city, some priests dressed to fashion came out to meet us. They burned incense before us, but said nothing. Our allies told Cortés that this is the kind of reception that brings a bad omen. They make war and plan to either sacrifice us or just plain murder us. They continue to see more cages of fattened up Indians, and Cortés, of course, starts to preach more about how this is sinful, they're all going to hell, and they needed to stop. His Tlaxcalteca allies reported that they witnessed 5 children sacrificed to their war god, and that it was extremely clear to them that they were about to be attacked. Cortés told them to be ready outside the city and wait for his word. La Malinche then told Cortés that a native woman told her that 10,000 Aztec warriors were ready to ambush the Spaniards, and that an order had been given to slaughter all but 20 of the Spaniards, the remaining being held to be sacrificed to their gods. After delegating with his officers, the Spanish decided that a preemptive attack was the only way to survive this. They had previously arranged 2,000 Cholulan warriors to march on the Aztec capital with them, but this was a trap, and they knew it. Cortés summoned everyone to the square with a message he wanted to deliver. With La Malinche mounted on his horse, he started to address the Cholulans. He explained to them that he knew about their plot to kill the Spanish and eat their flesh with salt, chilies, and tomatoes. The priest objected and blamed it on Montezuma, saying this all was orders from him. Cortés yelled back that this was a lie, and that since they had dishonored the great Montezuma, that for this terrible sin, they would all die. A musket was fired, signaling for the Spanish to attack, and all chaos breaks loose. Bernal Diaz described it as an absolute slaughter. All warriors and priests within the village cut down. When the Tlaxcalans arrived, they did not stop at the warriors and priests. They plundered the city, taking prisoners, and the Spanish basically wrote that it was impossible to stop them at this point. The Tlaxcalteca hated the Cholulans so much, and this was their opportunity. It was reported that 5,000 to 10,000 were slaughtered. The native accounts after the conquest reported 20,000 dead. After this massacre, Cortés immediately wrote about it in a second letter to Charles V. He claimed that the Cholulan leaders had plotted to trap and kill the Spaniards on Montezuma's orders, and that his strike was therefore a justified preemptive action. In the Florentine Codex, the natives described this as a trick by Cortés to lure them all into the square where he massacred them. Diaz writes in his chronicles that once Montezuma found out about this massacre, that he locked himself up for 2 days, sacrificing men to his sun god, trying to figure out what message he should send the Spaniards, and eventually he gave them an invitation to meet him in the city. Cortés accepted this offer despite the Tlaxcalans telling him that this was definitely a trap. In any case, 1,000 Tlaxcalan warriors and porters joined the Spaniards in March of that year as they headed toward the capital. The conquistadors were shocked when they saw their first volcano. We were all astonished by this, including Cortés, since he had never seen a volcano before. One of our captains, Diego de Ordaz, asked permission of Cortés to climb up there and see what it was. Cortés not only gave him his permission, but actually ordered him to go up. He took 2 soldiers and several Indians with him. When they had gone halfway up the mountain, the Indians were frightened and tried to dissuade Diego from climbing higher. There were earth tremors, flames, and stones and ash that were being thrown from the mouth of the volcano. They then continued their climb to the crater. From there, they could see the great city of Mexico, with its lakes and surrounding towns. In a desperate attempt to get the Spanish to turn around, Montezuma sends the Spanish more gold, lots of it. The Aztec account of this moment describes the Spanish lusting at the sight of this gold, holding on to it, clutching it, and examining every inch of the gold with joy and excitement. And this, of course, would have the opposite effect on the Spanish. They wanted to meet Montezuma more than ever. When the Spaniards entered the outskirts of the city, their minds were blown. Bernal Diaz admitted that he had never imagined such beauty and believed nothing greater could ever be found. We were struck speechless by the things we saw. It was hard to accept that it was real. On the one hand, the great cities filled the land, on the lakes even more. Canoes were everywhere. Before us was the great city of Mexico, and we were fewer than 400 soldiers. We couldn't help but remember the warnings from the Indians and all the others who had told us not to go to Mexico, and that once they had us inside, they would kill us all. As we drew near to Mexico, the great Montezuma stepped down from his litter, supported by two great lords beneath a canopy of extraordinary riches. Many of his nobles walked ahead of Montezuma, sweeping the ground wherever he went to pass. We were astonished by this. After what's described as an awkward but cheerful meeting between Montezuma and Cortés, the two sides exchanged gifts. The Spanish reported that Montezuma accepted their emperor as king and that he knew they were coming. Aguilar wrote, "For it was quite true that his ancestors had told him that men with beards who came from the direction of the sunrise would govern these lands, and from all he had seen, we were those men." Despite a peaceful meeting, Cortés of course has to throw a curveball in there. When they got settled into their living quarters, he ordered a cannon be fired, which caused the entire city to stop in terror. An Aztec chronicler documented this moment. "The Spaniards fired one of their cannons, and it caused great confusion in the city. The people scattered in every direction. It was as if they had eaten the mushrooms that confuse the mind, or had seen some dreadful apparition. They were all overcome by terror, as if their hearts had fainted. And when the night fell, the panic spread throughout the city, and their fears would not let them sleep." As time went on, the Spaniards got whatever they requested from Montezuma, and this was starting to really upset Montezuma's priests, nobles, and advisors. They were losing respect for him quickly. Cortés eventually met with Montezuma and explained to them that he had been sent by his king from the east to convert Montezuma and his people to Christians, explaining to them that if Montezuma did not stop sacrificing children and idol worship, that he would burn in hell. "I had heard that he frequently ate the flesh of young boys. Since he had such a variety of dishes in front of him, though, we couldn't tell if some of them might have been human flesh or if they were something else, so we tried not to look at what he was eating. I do know that once our captain had confronted him about making human sacrifices and eating human flesh, he ordered that this no longer be served to him." The Spaniards were stunned when they saw the main temple of the city. But this was overshadowed by horror. One chronicler estimated 136,000 skulls mounted on poles with mortar. Eventually they saw the markets, and the Spanish were very impressed. They had slaves, gold, food, herbs, wild animals, and even what the Spanish described as entire canoe loads of human excrement that was used to manufacture salt and cure animal hides. They walked up the steps of the large pyramid in the center, and Bernal Diaz wrote about what he describes as hell. Images of devils and bodies of serpents surround the door. A little apart from there stood a palace of sacrifice, all black with smoke and encrusted blood. Inside the house we saw many pots, pitchers, and jars, all filled with water, for it was here that they cooked the poor Indians after they had been sacrificed, and were eaten by the papas. I always thought of that house as hell. When the Spanish got back to their dwellings, they were kind of snooping around and found out that Montezuma's father's entire stash of gold was hidden right where they were sleeping, and they kept their knowledge about this secret. As time grew on, Cortés and his captains began to grow more concerned about the very dangerous situation they were in. They were outnumbered 40-1. News had just arrived that the Spaniards had been killed by natives on the coast, and it was clear that the Aztec were behind the attack. A decision was made to take Montezuma captive. They explained to him that he could rule over his people, but it would need to be under their custody while they sorted out the injustice of the dead Spanish men. After some time, Montezuma requested that he be allowed to make his sacrifices. The Spanish agreed as long as it was animals and not human sacrifices. And when they escorted him to his temples for this ritual, Montezuma broke his promise, and his priests brought out men and boys to be sacrificed. There was not much the Spanish could do about it. Greatly outnumbered in a very delicate situation, they said nothing and decided to just pick their own battles. Meanwhile, secretly, the Spanish were building ships, just in case they needed to escape the city. They explained to Montezuma that these were just for recreation. Many months go by as the Spanish continue to plot, and their welcome that they received starts to fade. Right as the Aztecs stop bringing them food on a regular basis, Cortés gets word that over 900 Spaniards have arrived on the coast, and they were there to arrest Cortés. Meanwhile, Montezuma apparently knew about this and sent them gifts as well, kind of playing both sides. Cortés had to go deal with this, so he leaves for the coast, taking many of his men with him, leaving behind a smaller group that's paranoid at this point, low morale, and not getting the proper nourishment they need each day to sustain themselves. Cortés eventually did a sneak attack on the Spanish camp. After a brief struggle, Captain Navarez, who was sent to arrest Cortés, refused to surrender, lost his eye, and it was over. Now Cortés had 900 Spanish soldiers. Meanwhile, back in the capital, a major conflict is brewing. Tensions in the city were high. The Spanish presence had become unbearable. Strange demands, desecration of idols, constant pressure for gold. Then came Tenochtitlan, which was a festival for one of their gods. Since Cortés was gone, Alvarado was now in charge, and the Aztec asked him for permission to do their festival. He agreed, and that decision would soon set fire to everything. The courtyard of Templo Mayor was filled with dancers. There were nobles, priests, singers, all dressed in brilliant costumes of feathers, jade, and gold. They moved in rhythm as they celebrated their festival. To the Aztec, this was one of the holiest moments of their calendar. But to the Spaniards watching them from the palace walls, it looked like something else. Alvarado later claimed that he had intelligence that the Aztec planned to use the festival to ambush the garrison. Whether or not this was paranoia or a genuine concern is still debated. According to the Aztec accounts preserved in the Florentine Codex, the Spaniards acted first. Then they stabbed everyone with iron lances and struck them with iron swords. Some they hacked on the calves, some on the thighs, some on their bellies, and then all their entrails would spill out. And there were some who were still running in vain. They were dragging their intestines and seemed to get their feet caught up in them. Eager to get to safety, they found nowhere to go. Whether or not it was a preemptive strike or an unprovoked butchery, the outcome remained the same. Rivers of blood flowed across the courtyard of Templo Mayor, and the natives were furious. News of this massacre spread like wildfire. The streets were filled with armed men. Tens of thousands of Aztec warriors surged toward the palace compound where the Spaniards were barricaded. For days they rained down arrows, stones, and spears. The Spaniards were trapped, low on food, low on water, unable to move, and Alvarado's rash actions had turned the city into a cage. Desperate, they sent word of their situation to the coast, hoping that Cortés could intervene. Now Cortés had access to 900 additional Spanish soldiers, convincing many of them with gold that it would be worth their while to follow him, and hurried back to the city. The Spaniards had brought Montezuma to the palace walls, hoping he could calm down the situation. According to the Spanish sources, Montezuma pleaded with his people to cease fighting, asking them to lay down their arms. But the crowd erupted in fury. Stones and darts filled the air, and Montezuma was struck. He died days later, the Spanish claiming that he succumbed to the wounds that he faced from the natives. But the Aztec accounts tell a darker story, that the Spaniards murdered him once he ceased to be useful. Either way, Montezuma was dead. The city exploded into all-out war. Trapped inside this palace with no food, the Spaniards endured a relentless assault. Cortés realized there was no way to hold the capital. He gave the order, prepare to retreat. They would flee the city by night, and that retreat would become known as La Noche Triste, the sad night. The plan was simple: march out under the cover of darkness, crossing the causeways, and escape to the mainland. But the Aztec knew every inch of this city. They smashed the bridges, cut off all exits, and swarmed from canoes on both sides. The Spaniards were struggling across the causeway, crossing with these makeshift beams they had created, but greed and the weight of gold would hold them back. Many of our soldiers, greedy for treasure, loaded themselves with it, and in crossing the bridges, they fell into the water and drowned. Hundreds of men and horses, both Spaniards and allies, sank into the lake, being drowned by the riches that they came to steal. In the book Conquistador Voices by Kevin Seipel, he explains a situation that occurred where the only way to cross was to use this pile of dead bodies as its own bridge, even pushing allies that were still alive into the water so they could try to cross. And this retreat became a slaughter. Warriors filled the causeways, hacking and stabbing with obsidian blades. Cortés himself was badly wounded in the leg during this disaster of a moment. Hundreds of conquistadors cut off and were captured on the causeway. Many of them were killed on the spot, but a very large number were kept alive to be sacrificed. They had lost more than half their forces, and that night they listened to their brothers scream as their chests were ripped open in clear sight. Diaz wrote that Cortés wept at this great tragedy, stopping for a moment to sob before continuing to retreat. But the Aztec pursued relentlessly. What was left of the Spanish continued to limp back to Tlaxcala, fighting the Aztec attacks along the way. At last they had reached refuge, and for over 20 days they rested, gathered themselves, and healed their wounds. Many who felt no loyalty to Cortés at this point asked to go back to Veracruz. They filed protests, denounced Cortés, and begged to sail home. Cortés stood firm. He reminded them of honor, of God, and of the gold that was still waiting back at the Aztec capital. And just like previous cases, he would successfully convince them to march again. But lucky for Cortés, something terrible was taking place back at the capital. Smallpox swept the valley. The streets were filling up with the dead, and even Montezuma's successor had died. A young and fierce ruler took his place. This was Cortés's opportunity. After healing from their wounds, they started to build forces with their new native and Spaniard reinforcements. A bombardment and conquest of the city was now being planned. And by 1521, the siege was ready. 1,000 Spanish soldiers and tens of thousands of native allies marched toward the city, which had been reinforced and ready to defend despite the smallpox outbreak. The aqueduct of Chapultepec was cut, leaving the city without water. Brigantines that had been built from scrap swept the lake, overturning thousands of canoes. They unleashed this bombardment, and the fighting lasted months, and they sustained heavy losses. More soldiers were captured and sacrificed. Cortés then turned to a strategy of burning the houses of the commoners, further adding to their discomfort. A few months later, by August, famine and disease had filled the city. The lake was fully controlled, supplies were cut off, and the Aztecs started to abandon their new leader. This young emperor fled in a royal canoe, carrying his family and treasure, but was later captured by the Spanish. He reportedly said to Cortés, "Malinche, I have done my duty in defending my city. I can do no more. I'm a prisoner before you, taken by stronger force. Now draw the dagger you have in your belt and kill me." Cortés reportedly refused, embraced him, and promised honor. The siege was now complete. For 80 days, the drums and trumpets of war had never ceased. Now there was only silence, broken by the stench of death. Hundreds of thousands were dead, bodies clogged the canals, houses were full of corpses, and starving survivors streamed out in endless lines. The stench was unbearable, and Cortés himself became ill and plagued with daily migraines due to the smell. He ordered that the streets be cleaned, water restored, and the bridges rebuilt. Rumors had started to spread that the young Aztec king had sunk the gold in the lake. Cortés then ordered the torturing of this emperor, having his feet burned with oil. But despite this, little was found. Discontent boiled among the soldiers, shares of wealth were pitiful. There were satirical verses of graffiti mocking Cortés that appeared on the wall, expressing their displeasure with Cortés and blaming him for stealing the gold. After the fall of the Aztec capital in 1521, Hernán Cortés stood, briefly, as one of the most powerful men in the world. He was named governor and captain general of New Spain, oversaw the rebuilding of Mexico City, and sent expeditions to Honduras, the Pacific coast, and even Baja California. But triumph soon gave way to conflict. Royal officials and rivals accused him of corruption and tyranny, and for the rest of his life, he would fight endless legal battles, returning to Spain to defend his reputation. He died in 1547 in Seville. Millions of indigenous would perish from disease and starvation, war, and forced labor. Meanwhile, gold and silver from the Americas poured into Europe, fueling Spain's rise as the richest kingdom on earth, in an era known as Spain's Golden Age, a subject for a future video. And as this new order settled, rumors spread of another kingdom further south, with even more riches and gold. This land had mountains and roads, and before long, Francisco Pizarro would march on modern-day Peru, and the conquest of the Inca would rival, even surpass, the drama of Mexico. The Spanish conquest of the Inca is a story so wild, so violent, and so epic that it's hard to understand why Hollywood refuses to make a movie about it. Two civilizations, so different from one another, that each encounter left incredible stories of strange oddities. This is the true, uncensored story of the Spanish conquest of Peru, the one they didn't teach you in school. The year's 1485 in the high Andes of South America. Recently, I was looking at eclipse data from NASA and noticed a total solar eclipse passed directly through the newly conquered lands of northern Peru, and curiously, its path eventually traveled over the northern tip of Spain. That same year, Christopher Columbus was arriving to this new kingdom, seeking to gain royal support for his ambitions to discover a new trade route to Asia. It was probably hard to imagine for the Inca at the time, but their civilization was on a parabolic rise, with the peak right around the corner. Masters of stone, builders of roads that spanned mountains and deserts, rulers of over 10 million people from Ecuador to Chile, surrounded by some of the world's most astonishing megaliths. In 1492, 7 years after that eclipse, Columbus would land in the New World, mistaking it for Asia. In the decades that followed, the Spanish swept through the Caribbean, establishing new colonies and searching endlessly for gold. By 1521, Hernán Cortés had conquered the mighty Aztec Empire, but before any Spaniard could enter the Inca kingdom, a silent enemy would strike first. Smallpox, carried along ancient trade routes from Mexico, swept through the Andes like wildfire. Among the victims was the Inca emperor Huayna Cápac, whose sudden death left no clear heir. His sons Huáscar and Atahualpa plunged the Inca kingdom into a brutal civil war. For 4 years, the brothers tore their worlds apart. Towns burned, nobles executed, tens of thousands slaughtered. and Atahualpa proved the stronger. In 1532, at the final battle, he crushed Huascar's armies and took his brother prisoner. Atahualpa now stood supreme. Let's rewind to 1511, where the Spaniards had colonies in Panama and rumors were starting to spread about a very rich kingdom to the south full of gold. 2 years later, Vasco Núñez de Balboa hacked his way through the jungles and became the first European to see the Pacific Ocean from the New World. His discovery proved once and for all that Columbus had not reached Asia. Among Balboa's men was Francisco Pizarro, an illiterate soldier who couldn't even spell his own name, but who'd clawed his way out of poverty, coming to the New World to make a life for himself. Balboa's discovery would make him the governor of Darien, but success breeds rivals. He was accused of plotting a rebellion to the crown, and the very man who marched beside him, Francisco Pizarro, sided with the opposition. Pizarro personally arrested Balboa, who was tried and had his head chopped off in 1519. Francisco Pizarro then started to gain more respect and responsibilities, and he started to make a name for himself. As the whispers of southern riches grew louder, he forged a partnership with Diego de Almagro, a rough adventurer, and Hernando de Luque, a priest. Pooling their resources together, they launched an expedition with 2 ships and 100 men, and what followed was misery. Rough seas delayed progress, and the Spaniards soon found themselves running out of food. Pizarro sent one of the ships up the coast to stock up on food and supplies, and he stayed back and waited. The vessel was late to return, and over 20 men died of disease and hunger. The survivors sustained themselves by stealing corn from a nearby village that they had found. Elsewhere was Pizarro's partner Almagro, who was on a different ship that had left later. They fought natives on the coastline, and a spear was thrust into Almagro's eye. The now one-eyed Spaniard met up with a separate ship that had gone further south, and told stories of a large Incan trading vessel, gold, and a highly organized society with roads and well-made buildings. When Pizarro heard about this story, he pressed on south with the soldiers that had survived. He reached the Gulf of Guayaquil and saw the great mountain peak of Chimborazo piercing the clouds. Along the coast there were gold ornaments, paved roads, and organized towns, just enough proof to feed his ambitions. In 1528, just 2 years after they had left the colony, Pizarro staggered back to Panama. His men were emaciated, their scraps of treasure hardly enough to impress. Over 20 men had died. Governor Pedro de los Rios dismissed Peru as nothing but another foolish myth, but the 3 partners would not give up. The priest Luque urged Pizarro to go directly to the Spanish crown himself. The illiterate 53-year-old man sailed across the Atlantic with llamas, gold ornaments, fine clothes, and captured natives to prove what he had seen. He stood before the court of Charles V, and after months of delay, in 1529, Queen Isabella signed the capitulation of Toledo. Pizarro was named governor and captain general of Nueva Castilla. He returned to his hometown of Trujillo to recruit family members and friends. His brothers Hernando, Juan, Gonzalo, and a cousin Pedro would join the expedition. This was likely a proud moment for Pizarro. From pig herder to royal governor, he had climbed the ranks beyond all odds. When they arrived back in Panama, Almagro found out that his rank was lower than his partner Pizarro, and he exploded with anger. Pizarro's royal commissions gave him prestige and riches, while Almagro was left humiliated. Their partnership nearly collapsed, but they swallowed their hatred for the sake of the mission. If the rumors of wealth were to be taken true, there would be plenty for Almagro. It took almost a year in Panama to scrape together 180 men and 27 horses. With prayers offered at Mass, they set sail south to face the Inca Empire. The plan was for Almagro to stay behind briefly to continue to recruit men and meet up with his partners later. Driven ashore on Colombia's coast, the Captain Pizarro led his men through the swamps and deserted villages, starving on scraps of maize. A midnight storm drowned one soldier in their flooded camp. They pressed forward through rivers and swamps, dragging themselves and their horses across on makeshift rafts. Hunger forced them to gorge on crabs from a marsh, only to discover later that the crabs had fed on a poisonous tree. And that night, almost the entire camp was suffering with violent illness. South along the coast, they struck the village of Coque. Its terrified inhabitants fled, and the Spaniards ransacked homes, seizing gold, silver, emeralds, and corn. Pizarro sent treasure back to Panama to try and recruit fresh soldiers. But their health was deteriorating fast. In the camps along the coast, a gruesome epidemic spread through Pizarro's men. Chroniclers describe wart-like swellings, sores that festered, and in some cases bled men to death when they were lanced. The soldiers laid crippled, their strength was gone, while storms slashed on the shoreline. For a moment the conquest itself seemed doomed, An army of fewer than 200, reduced by hunger, sickness, and despair. Lucky for the starving Spaniards, relief was on its way. New ships landed fresh supplies and with them reinforcements. Among the new arrivals was Hernando de Soto, a man who would change the course of the expedition. Younger and sharper than most, he had fought in Nicaragua and already earned a name as one of the best horsemen in the Indies. The timing was perfect for an invasion. The Spaniards were getting intel about the Inca Civil War, and in April of 1532, Pizarro loaded men and horses onto ships, preparing to march on Tumbes, a city he had visited in an earlier expedition. When they arrived, they were shocked to see that the city was in ruins, recently being destroyed in the Inca Civil War. Pizarro left 3 Spaniards behind in Tumbes to learn the language and culture. He would later find out that they were murdered by locals soon after they left. Pizarro moved south and founded the town of San Miguel de Tangarara, the first Spanish town in Peru, leaving 50 men to hold it. After getting the town established and gathering provisions, he began his march into the Andes with less than 200 soldiers. They were astonished by the landscape. Roaring rivers, snow-capped peaks with beautiful villages along the way. Pizarro sent Hernando de Soto ahead as a scout, and on the road, Soto found women, weaving for the army and the porters guarding them. At the gates, several corpses swung upside down by their feet, punishment by King Atahualpa for breaking discipline by sleeping with his concubines. Soto also marveled at the Inca highways, bridges, and architecture. Proof of a civilization both advanced and terrifying in scale. A messenger gave the Spaniards duck meat and incense, and a message that the Inca Lord awaited the Spaniards in peace. Pizarro would later catch up, and when the Spaniards entered Cajamarca, they were astonished by their welcome. The city was full of hot springs, making it a favorite location for the royal elite. Atahualpa's messengers brought food, chicha, and gifts of fine cloth. When they arrived at the temples, they described hot water being piped in on magnificently carved pipes with just the right amount of cold water also being piped in for an ideal temperature. De Soto was led to Atahualpa, the Inca prince, in a scene that left him uneasy. At first, Atahualpa didn't respond to them or even raise his eyes from the ground. A dignitary spoke for him. When Atahualpa spat up phlegm, he never let it touch the ground. One of his women caught it in her hands, and if a strand of his hair fell, they swallowed it whole. The Spaniards later learned that he feared witchcraft, and this was a ritual to protect him. De Soto expressed that Governor Pizarro wanted to meet him, to which the Inca prince responded bluntly that he received word that the Spanish were worthless fighters, and that they had recently killed a few of their men near their camps in San Miguel. De Soto responded sharply. I told him that the Indians around San Miguel were like women, and that one of our horsemen would be sufficient to put all of them down. When you see us fight, you'll see exactly who we are. When that awkward meeting ended, the Inca prince asked to see a horse charge. One of the Spaniards galloped past him, sending dozens of his men scattering. Afterward, the Spaniards learned that Atahualpa had those men rounded up and beheaded for showing their fear. That night, Pizarro's men stood watch with growing dread. There were rumors about 30,000 warriors hiding in the hillside, but they really did not know what to believe. A decision was made to take action. On November 16th, Pizarro elected to take out the Inca Empire in one blow. Pizarro hid his men and ordered for the artillery to be aimed at the city square and told them to wait for his signal. He commanded that Atahualpa be taken alive, his bargaining chip for the conquest of Peru. Then came the moment. Atahualpa's army filled the plaza. There were singers, dancers, and nobles glittered in gold and silver. At the center was Atahualpa, carried high on a golden litter, lined with parrot feathers, attended by lords and princes. The Spaniards held their breath as he entered the trap. A friar stepped forward holding a cross and a Bible, and through his interpreter he demanded Atahualpa accept the Christian faith and the authority of the Spanish king. Atahualpa asked to see the book. He took it, struggled to open it, and then flung it to the ground and ordered his men to ready themselves, telling the Spaniards they were thieves and that he would kill them all. But before they could organize, artillery was fired directly into a group of natives in the center. Muskets were fired, and cavalry thundered from hiding. Panic tore through the crowded plaza. Unarmed Inca servants and attendants were butchered where they stood, crushed by horses, cut down by swords, and ripped apart by pikes and daggers. In the chaos, Pizarro shouted that Atahualpa must not be killed. He wanted him alive. Night fell on Cajamarca with the streets choked in blood. 4,000 Inca lay dead in the city. Not a single Spaniard died. Atahualpa, the ruler of this powerful empire, was now in custody. Pizarro wasted no time. He fortified Cajamarca to make this a new stronghold. That night, he dined with his captive. The Inca was seated at the governor's own table and served as if he were still a king. His women attendants were released from confinement and returned to him, and he was given his own room under guard. As time went on, the Spaniards were getting to know Atahualpa, writing that he was extremely smart, learning Spanish in only 20 days, and even learning how to play cards and chess. He was especially curious about the Spanish communicating with writing. He wore a cloak made out of vampire bat skin that was described as softer than silk. Likely fearing for his life, Atahualpa offered the Spaniards the deal of a lifetime, promising to fill up an entire room with gold and silver. The Spaniards were overwhelmed by this proposal, unsure about whether to believe him. 2,000 Indian porters were ordered to Cusco to begin carrying treasure back to Cajamarca. Vessels of gold were brought by the ton, and Atahualpa became worried that his captive brother would also bribe them with gold. To prevent this, he gave the order to execute his brother by sending men to drown him. For the Spaniards, Cajamarca was both a treasure house and a trap. If Almagro and his reinforcements from Panama did not soon come, they would be left surrounded, outnumbered, and sitting on a fortune too heavy to carry away. As months went on, no reinforcements had arrived, and the gold still was not being brought in. Their patience started to fade. The rumors about the 30,000 Inca warriors in the hillside had the Spaniards terrified. Atahualpa's general Chalcochimac led this army and was in possession of a large amount of gold. Rumors spread that he was about to march on Cajamarca and free their emperor. He sent word to his younger brother to greet him with promises of peace, inviting the general under safe conduct. Chalcochimac accepted, but once they got back to Cajamarca, he soon realized that this was a trap and that he was no longer in control. He was immediately seized, bound, and taken prisoner, and with one stroke, Pizarro removed the greatest threat to his army. The ransom chamber filled with gold, and Pizarro and his men had more wealth than they'd ever seen in their life. They immediately paid off their debts, some of them even paying double what they owed without thinking twice about it. Gold was flying from person to person. Yet the fear still lingered. As long as Atahualpa was alive, the Spaniards feared of rebellion. Pizarro originally did not want to kill him and resisted the suggestion that was being urged by his captains. But eventually, they would convince him that it would be in their best interest to do so. A trial was staged, and the charges were idolatry, treason, and the murder of his brother Huascar. Atahualpa reportedly begged for his life as he realized what was happening. He was sentenced to be burned alive unless he agreed to be baptized, which he accepted. Instead of being burned alive, he would instead be strangled to death with a cord in the center square of Cajamarca. His death shocked the empire. Atahualpa's sisters, wives, and some of his troops hanged themselves. For the Spaniards, they tried to justify their decision. The chronicler Jerez wrote, "All said with a single voice that he was the greatest and cruelest butcher they had ever seen, that for a trivial reason he would wipe out a village, or for one person's petty crime murder 10,000. He was a tyrant despised by all." Almagro and the reinforcements finally arrived, but instead of celebration, the Spaniards almost turned to blood. Diego de Almagro arrived with more than 100 fresh men, saving his army from being swallowed by the Inca forces. Yet his men demanded their share of the glittering ransom already held in Cajamarca. Pizarro's veterans were not happy with this. They had risked everything, and now newcomers wanted the spoils. The square nearly erupted in violence. They finally would come to a truce. Almagro's men would get a small portion of what had been captured, and then their equal share for anything else that would be captured on their way to Cusco. After Atahualpa's murder, the Spaniards needed a figurehead to calm the empire. They installed his brother Tupac Hualpa, parading him around as the new Inca under Spanish control. This was not recognized as legitimate by many of the Andean nobles, but it gave the illusion of continuity while Pizarro pushed toward Cusco. In August 1533, Pizarro set out from Cajamarca with fewer than 200 Spaniards, joined by thousands of native warriors, including the captured general Chalcochimac, who was very upset about Tupac Hualpa being chosen as the new leader. Along the way, they stopped at a village where Chalcochimac convinced Pizarro that the chiefs were not good people and asked for permission to deal with them. Pizarro granted him permission to do as he saw fit. The younger Pedro Pizarro describes a very violent scene. Given this license, Chalcochimac summoned all the caciques from the area, asking each one to bring with him the largest stones out in line, then ordered them to lie on the ground, each with his head resting upon a stone. Taking another stone in his hand now, he smashed the head of the first man, flattening it like a tortilla, then moved on to do the same to the next man. When Governor Pizarro got word of this, he sent an order for it to stop. They pushed forward, and Hernando de Soto ranged ahead with 60 horsemen to scout the roads and clear ambushes. Almagro was to follow later with reinforcements, but the main gamble was Francisco's. to reach Cusco before the Inca generals could gather their armies. And this march was brutal. The column crossed frozen passes where men and horses collapsed from cold and thin air. They staggered their way across sheer cliffs, narrow edges, and swaying rope bridges. Entire villages lay silent, their people fled or dead from the recent civil war. In the valleys, the Spaniards marched past piles of bodies. Warriors who had slaughtered each other in the war were now rotting in the sun. On this march, King Tupac would suddenly die. The Spaniards became suspicious of Chalcochimac, blaming him for the death and plotting a rebellion. He was sentenced to be burned alive despite denying these claims. After Tupac's death, they installed another brother to be a puppet leader named Manco Inca. Bloodied but unbroken, the Spaniards pressed south, with Cusco still waiting ahead. In November of 1533, after months of fighting through the mountains, the Spaniards and their native allies entered Cusco without resistance. The city absolutely stunned them. Palaces of finely cut stone lined the streets, temples flashed with gold panels. The conquistadors who had come from Panama with villages of mud and timber walked in silence through stone walls fit without mortar, rising higher than their heads. They started to establish themselves in the city, getting to know the inhabitants and their customs. One of Pizarro's captains came forward with a very strange request. He wished to marry an Inca woman who had belonged to another man. The Inca, bound by their own customs, insisted that permission must come from her late husband. The governor sent Pedro Pizarro to oversee the matter, which Pedro described in detail. I actually thought I was going to be speaking with a living Indian, but they instead led me to a bundle, a dead man, who was seated on a litter. The Indian who was to speak for the dead man was seated on one side of the bundle and the woman on the other. The captain and I approached, and the interpreter delivered the question. There was a long pause as the spokesman looked at the woman, probably to judge what her wish was. And then both she and the spokesman answered together that the dead man had granted the request. The captain then led the woman away. Every day they took these corpses out, seating them in a row in the plaza in order of seniority. Their caretakers then ate and drank in their presence, and they lit fires before the dead, burning a very dry piece of firewood that had been smoothed and shaped very evenly for the purpose. Once the fires were burning, they burned all the food they had placed before the dead so that they might partake of whatever the others were eating, which they did by means of the fire. Pizarro would later go on to describe the women of this region. Some of these women were quite tall. They valued long hair and tried to cultivate it. Almost all of them were daughters of lords and nobles, and they all regarded themselves as beautiful. Among the common women were the Guancas, the Chachapoyas, and the Cafleres, who were the most beautiful and cleanest, and the rest were just thick. Neither beautiful nor ugly, but average. The people of this kingdom are light-complected, olive-skinned, and among both lords and ladies we saw some that were very white, like Spaniards. I once saw an Indian woman and child who were as light as any white blonde. The women of the mountains were absorbed as porters, carrying their husbands' loads anywhere that they would go. The Spaniards witnessed them doing this while pregnant, even stopping on the trail to give birth. They would then wash the baby, pick up their load, and continue their job of transporting goods. The looting of the city would almost begin immediately. Golden plates from the Coricancha, the Temple of the Sun, were pried off, idols seized, mummies carried away and desecrated. For the Inca, the heart of their empire was defiled in front of their eyes. For the Spaniards, it was wealth beyond measure. At the fortress of Sacsayhuaman, above the city, they saw stones the size of houses, some weighing over 100 tons, interlocked with what felt like impossible precision. Cusco became the home base, and after the looting, Pizarro got to work sending out expeditions to find gold and silver mines throughout the region. But a major headache popped up for Governor Pizarro. They got word that Pedro de Alvarado, one of Hernán Cortés's fiercest captains in the conquest of Mexico and later governor of Guatemala, was about to march on Quito in 1534 with 600 Spaniards and thousands of native allies. His army was wrecked by rains, hunger, and disease in the Andes. Before he could seize the city, Almagro and De Soto raced to beat him. Too weak to fight, Alvarado agreed to a deal where he would receive silver and gold to turn around and go back home. This deal had spared civil war, and the Inca nobles could now see it clearly. The foreigners were very much divided, quarreling over treasure and power. Whispers spread that the empire might still be saved. At the center stood Manco Inca, the young puppet emperor installed by the Spaniards after Atahualpa's death. At first, Manco cooperated, hoping that the Spaniards would take their loot and just leave. He rode with them on campaigns and gave orders in their name. But despite this loyalty, Manco endured constant humiliation, being treated with terrible disrespect by Gonzalo Pizarro. who stole one of his wives to have as his own. By 1535, Manco had had enough. He quietly dispatched messengers into every valley and province, summoning chiefs still loyal to the dynasty. From north to south, warriors gathered in secret. He escaped Cusco, and by that time, 100,000 warriors had answered the call. In May of 1536, Manco Inca descended on Cusco. Spanish chroniclers wrote that the mountains around the city glowed with campfires. They were armed with slings, clubs, spears, and captured Spanish weapons, and the Inca surged into the valley. They set Cusco on fire, torching temples and palaces until the sky turned red from the flames. Inside the city, fewer than 200 Spaniards and their allies braced for annihilation. For weeks they fought in the streets, charging with horses, firing crossbows from rooftops, dragging artillery from plaza to plaza. Hernando, Gonzalo, and Juan Pizarro led desperate counterattacks, but each day the siege tightened. Above Cusco loomed Sacsayhuaman, the massive fortress built with cyclopean stones, walls rising in great zigzag terraces. Whoever held it commanded the city below. At the start of the siege, Manco's warriors seized the stronghold, using its height to rain down stones and spears onto Cusco. A daring assault was ordered. Under relentless fire, Spanish cavalry and infantry stormed the steep slopes, fought hand-to-hand with swords, maces, and bare stone. During this fight, Juan Pizarro, who led the charge, was struck in the head by a stone and mortally wounded, a major blow to the conquistadors' morale and leadership. The Spaniards were astonished by one of the Inca generals that seemed to display levels of bravery that defied reality. This Inca captain, who wore a Spanish morion on his head, carried a leather shield on one arm, and wielded a Spanish sword with his other hand. He had acquired all of these items from Spaniards who had died along the way or had been captured by the Indians. This captain darted quickly back and forth on the heights of the fortress tower, keeping the Spaniards from climbing up their ladders and killing any Indians who were ready to surrender. I'm sure he killed at least 30 of them who tried to surrender, smashing their heads with his cudgel. But when the captain realized that the Spaniards had won the fortress, he threw down his weapons, pulled his cloak over his head and face, and hurled himself over the edge, being dashed to pieces below. For many months, Cusco remained encircled. Supplies dwindled, the streets were choked with corpses, and disease spread. During all this, the Inca were running out of resources. Their constant marches were draining their supplies, and their Spaniards were attacking their trade routes. And by the fall of 1536, the Great Siege had been broken. Manco Inca pulled his warriors back into the mountains, ruling as a king in exile, still defiant, still fighting, even as the Spaniards tightened their grip on Cusco. Hoping for diplomacy, the Spaniards sent a black slave to deliver a pony, some native women, and gifts. Upon arrival, Manco Inca had the slave and the pony killed. The Spaniards then killed one of Manco's wives and burned 12 of Manco's captains alive. They placed his wife's body in a basket and floated it down the river for Manco's forces to find. The siege of Cusco was the closest the Inca came to driving out the conquistadors. Large parts of the city were left in ruin, and the rebellion proved two things to Pizarro. The Inca would never accept Spanish rule quietly, and Cusco's high mountains made it a poor choice for a colonial capital. In 1535, he founded a new city on the Pacific coast, later to be named Lima, the City of Kings, which would soon eclipse Cusco as the seat of Spanish power in Peru. But the fragile partnership between Francisco Pizarro and Diego de Almagro finally was about to break apart. The crown's grants of territory were vague, and both men claimed rights over Cusco. Pizarro insisted the city was his. Almagro had been exploring his undisputed claims further south and found little wealth, which likely caused him to purposefully misinterpret the boundaries of his territory due to vague wording from the crown on whether the distance of a league was measured on the coast or on land. Tensions grew until they erupted in open confrontation. In 1537, while Hernando and Gonzalo Pizarro held Cusco, Diego de Almagro marched with his troops. The city changed hands very quickly, and Hernando was taken prisoner. The Pizarros were humiliated, and for months Almagro ruled Cusco, trying to reconcile with Manco Inca in the hills. But time was against him. Reinforcements for the Pizarros poured in from Lima. In April of 1538, the two factions met at Las Salinas near Cusco. Hundreds of Spaniards faced on one another in the field, steel against steel, the empire's conquerors now at war with themselves. The battle was brutal and decisive. Almagro's men were overwhelmed, his artillery seized, his cavalry broken. The old governor was captured and dragged back to Cusco in chains. Almagro was strangled and then beheaded. His enemies Hernando and Gonzalo Pizarro attended his Christian funeral sitting in the front row. If Almagro would have just been patient, he would have found out that his undisputed lands in Chile, Bolivia, and southern Peru would turn out to be quite wealthy, and now all of this was in the hands of Pizarro, at least momentarily. But Almagro's followers, the Almagristas, did not stop with their rebellion. They rallied around his son, known as El Mozo, who Almagro had fathered with a native woman decades prior. Though Manco Inca still resisted from the valleys of Villacamba, it was now Spaniards against Spaniards that determined Peru's fate. Francisco Pizarro, ruling from Lima, built palaces, raised cathedrals, and appointed governors. Outwardly, his power seemed absolute, yet in the taverns of Cusco and Lima, Almagro's old loyalists whispered of a blood debt. The crown was very upset with the Pizarros for executing Almagro. The younger Hernando Pizarro would go to Spain during this time to defend their decision in court. He was very surprised upon arrival to find out just how angry people were with them. He would soon be imprisoned for the next 20 years of his life. And on Sunday, June 26, 1541, the day of reckoning would arrive. Governor Francisco Pizarro, then in his 60s, was in his palace in Lima, dining with friends after Mass. A band of Almagristas, armed with swords, forced their way inside. Francisco, aged but still fierce, seized a sword and tried to fight them off. It's said that he cut down 2 attackers before being surrounded. A blade pierced his throat, another struck his side, and he fell bleeding across the floor. Before he died, witnesses swore he traced a cross in his own blood upon the tiles, kissed it, and whispered a final prayer. Then the conqueror of the Inca Empire lay dead, butchered not by Andean warriors, but his own countrymen. When Francisco Pizarro was cut down in Lima in June of 1541, Peru plunged into turmoil. The assassins, 4 men of Diego de Almagro, proclaimed his illegitimate son, Diego de Almagro the Younger, as governor. Barely in his 20s, El Mozo was paraded through Cusco as his father's avenger. But El Mozo lacked his father's authority. In Lima and along the coast, most Spaniards denounced him. His rule would quickly dissolve into a fragile, contested claim to power. And when news of Pizarro's assassination reached Spain, the crown decided to stomp out this entire mess in Peru once and for all. They sent Cristobal Vaca de Castro with full authority to crush the chaos. Marching through the Andes, he rallied towns, provinces, and Pizarro loyalists under the royal banner. In 1542, near Ayacucho, El Mozo's Almagristas faced Vaca de Castro's army. Cavalry charged, guns cracked, hundreds of Spaniards died, and the king's official force overwhelmed and captured El Mozo. Tried for rebellion, he was quickly executed in Cusco with his severed head on display, serving as a warning to anyone who would dare rebel against the crown. Yet in the wilds of Peru, Manco Inca still organized a resistance until 1544. Several Almagro loyalists went to him seeking refuge from the royal officials now in Peru, knowing they would be executed if they were caught. He spared them and gave them the refuge they were seeking. Unfortunately for Manco Inca, these Spaniards decided that their only chance for a pardon would be to kill the rebellious native leader. They killed Manco Inca, hoping for this pardon, but would be slaughtered by natives before they could make their escape. Despite this, the resistance carried on the fight for another generation, and only in 1572, with the capture and execution of Tupac Amaru I, did the last flame of the Inca resistance finally die. Gold, power, and pride had consumed the conquerors, and the empire they had bled to seize was now the property of a distant king from Spain. This wouldn't be the end for the Pizarros, though. Even before Francisco's murder in Lima, his half-brother Gonzalo had already marched beyond Cusco, north into Ecuador, and east into uncharted territories, which would kickstart the discovery of the Amazon, and one of the most epic and brutal stories of human survival ever told. This is the true story of a Spanish expedition that discovered for themselves the Amazon River and all of its misery, and almost every one of them died. They claimed to have encountered a powerful civilization hidden deep on the river, ruled, they said, by tall white warrior women, unlike any tribe they'd ever seen before. Gonzalo Pizarro, brother of the conqueror and governor of Peru, Francisco Pizarro, had earned a reputation as a ruthless soldier in the wars that shattered the Inca Empire. But with Peru tearing itself apart, new legends began to spread of El Dorado, the Gilded King, and La Canela, a land of cinnamon richer than the spice routes to the east. He was appointed governor of Quito in what is now Ecuador, and this is where Gonzalo saw his chance. He would march east across the Andes into uncharted lands and beyond. As Gonzalo prepared his expedition, chaos would consume the newly conquered lands of Peru. His brother Francisco ruled from Lima, but rebellion was closing in. The Inca still resisted from the mountains of Villacamba, while the followers of the executed Almagro plotted revenge. By the time Gonzalo was lost in the jungle, Francisco Pizarro had been murdered, and the empire they'd carved from the Andes was already falling apart. He led hundreds of conquistadors, 4,000 native porters, 200 pigs and war dogs bred to kill. As they crossed the Andes, volcanoes erupted above them as they climbed through the pass. Beyond the mountains, the air grew heavy, the trails vanished into jungle, and the horses began to die. And soon, they were eating them. A crude boat was built to carry their belongings while the majority marched on shore. Among the men who followed Gonzalo was a friar, a holy man, Gaspar de Carvajal. While everyone else was dying, he was still writing, a day-by-day record of starvation, battles, and endless rivers ahead. His journal became the best surviving account of the expedition and is largely the reason we know what happened, and it will be the primary source I use to narrate this video. But more Spaniards were on their way. Francisco de Orellana, a seasoned captain and ally of Pizarro, had heard of the expedition and resigned his post to join it. He spent over 40,000 gold pesos outfitting his men and marched across the highlands with just 23 soldiers. This march to join him would quickly turn into a disaster. They lost most of their supplies, they were starved, they were lost, and when they finally did reach Gonzalo, the expedition was already collapsing. The pigs were gone, the horses were eaten, the men were starving. The small boat they had built for their luggage was used to drift 20 leagues downstream, finding only abandoned villages and empty shores. Facing death from starvation, Orellana proposed to take 57 men downriver to see if they could find food and provisions. The holy man Carvajal describes this moment. Captain Orellana picked out 57 men. They journeyed on boat in certain canoes which they had taken from the Indians, and he began to proceed down this river with the idea of promptly turning back if food was found. All of which turned out just the reverse of what we all expected, because we did not find food for a distance of 200 leagues, nor were we finding any food for ourselves, from which cause we suffered very greatly. And so we kept going on, beseeching our Lord to see fit to guide us on that journey in such a way that we might return to our companions. For 3 days they found no people and no food, and the little that they brought for this little scouting trip was gone. Talks of turning back died fast. The current made that a fantasy. They boiled belts and shoe soles with herbs to eat, and they consumed unknown plants and nearly died. Men crawled on all fours looking for roots because they were too weak to stand. After Orellana left to search for food, Gonzalo Pizarro and men who remained behind were trapped in the upper Amazon with almost no supplies. Weeks passed and Orellana never returned. The native porters, starving, sick, and exhausted, began to desert or die by the hundreds, slipping back into the jungle. Pizarro tried to push forward, but soon realized the river was endless and the jungle impassable. With no food left, his men resorted to eating dogs, leather, and roots to survive. They were barefoot and emaciated. Pizarro felt betrayed by Orellana, convinced that he abandoned him to make the discovery for himself. He returned broken, his reputation impacted, and with no solid prospects for the riches of cinnamon that he was after. On New Year's Day, 1542, some of Orellana's men swore they had heard drums. Others said it was in their heads. Their hope rose and then it fell. But on Monday, January 8th, while chewing roots in the bush, they heard the drums again. That night no one slept. They set watches by quarters and kept powder dry if they could. At dawn they went 2 leagues. 4 canoes appeared, saw them, and spun away upriver. And within minutes the shores filled with layered drum beats. They rammed the riverbank, jumped to the land in order, with their shields up, swords under arm, crossbows and arquebuses ready. The villagers pulled back, and they left food in their houses. Corn, fish, and cooked meat. Despite the danger that they were in, they were relieved of their hunger while they stood guard. The cacique arrived, and Orellana greeted him. They gave gifts and asked for food, nothing else. The chief ordered meat, turkeys, and fish to be brought, and the men ate, rested, and kept guard. It was here that Orellana took formal possession in the name of His Majesty and explained simply who they were and why they came. Food was flowing in daily, and it was here that Orellana decided that they needed to build a better boat. Soon after, 4 or 5 canoes arrived with turtles and baskets of fish. Their chief said they served Aparilla, who welcomed the Spaniards to his settlement. The cacique Aparilla warned of powerful women further downriver, which intrigued the Spaniards. It was here, with the help of the cacique, that they started to build the new boat. In 35 days, they launched the new ship. While they were laboring, 4 very tall men visited, each taller than the tallest Spaniard. They were described as white with hair to their waist. They had gold, and they were humble in their manners. They presented them food, told them that they served a great lord, accepted gifts, and left, and no one ever saw them again. They left Aparia in April of 1542 in their new brigantine. For many days, villages along the river still brought them food, but after 80 leagues, the riverbanks fell silent. They had passed beyond Aparia's lands. While moving downstream, one of the men fired a crossbow at a bird perched over the river. The bolt's nut flew off and vanished into the water, leaving the weapon useless. Another soldier hooked a huge fish soon after, and when they cut it open, they found the missing nut inside the belly. They fixed the crossbow, an odd bit of luck that would soon save their lives, and they saw this as a sign that God was still in their favor. On May 12th, they entered lands where they encountered old warriors, 30 to 70 years old, with thin mustaches, no beards. What they didn't quite know yet was that they belonged to a village of 50,000 people. Before they were 2 leagues away, they saw evidence of this gigantic settlement along the banks. Then the river filled with painted war canoes while war drums echoed from the shore. Orellana ordered that the 2 boats stay together. He armed his men and told them to fight for their lives and trust God. The holy man Gaspar de Carvajal wrote the following: "Here there happened to us a misfortune by no means slight, when one considers the situation we were in, which was that the arquebusiers' powder was damp, and it was necessary for the crossbows to make up for the deficiency of the arquebuses. And so our crossbowmen began to inflict some damage on the enemy. They fought as they drifted until they reached the main village. They were now starting to understand the sheer size of this settlement and the danger they were in. But once again they were desperate for food, and they had no choice but to land or die on the river. The brigantines rammed the bank, and half the men jumped waist deep into the river, shields up, blades forward, while the other half stayed aboard to keep the canoes off with crossbows and whatever the arquebuses would fire. They took 25 men and probed half a league through the settlement. When they came back, they reported that food was everywhere. Pins full of turtles, pools full of fishes, and meat, enough to feed 1,000 men for a year. Orellana planned to rest a few days and gather food, but when his men collected over 1,000 turtles, they were ambushed by nearly 2,000 warriors. The first attack left several wounded. The second was worse, with close fighting that injured 8 more Spaniards. Another group of warriors circled around to strike from the rear, catching the exhausted men off guard. 4 were already down when Orellana charged in with his sword, leading a counterattack that broke a force of more than 500. The enemies tried to trap the Spaniards in a narrow bend, but an arquebusier shot their commander dead. The line broke, and Orellana seized the gap, driving back into the wide river. It took 2 days and 2 nights of running battles to clear the region, 80 leagues of almost continuous settlement. For the first time, the Spaniards realized that they had discovered for themselves a true civilization, one with villages that stretched for miles, with fields cultivated, and a population far greater than anyone in Europe had imagined. By their count, they had traveled 340 leagues since they had built the new brigantine. That's roughly 1,000 miles, and most of it through empty country. They continued for over 100 leagues and entered a country named Patagonia. It was a civilized country full of Peru-style sheep. It had silver and more fruit that they could list: pineapples, avocados, plums, custard apples. On the day before Holy Trinity, they took another village, stocked up on food, and that same afternoon came to a dark, slow-moving river. The water was almost black, so they named it Rio Negro. For miles it ran like a black ribbon through the Amazon before finally blending in. In one of the villages they found a large carved wooden monument that they described as a detailed walled city. Locals said they were subjects of the Amazons, bringing parrot feathers as a tribute for their temples. Friar Gaspar de Carvajal describes this monument as an emblem of a woman who ruled over these lands. In short, the construction was a thing well worth seeing, and the captain and all of us, marveling at such a great thing, asked an Indian who was seized here by us what that was, and the Indian answered that they were subjects and tributaries of the Amazons, and the only service that they rendered them consisted in supplying them with plumes of parrots and macaws for the linings of the roofs, and that they worshipped it as a thing which was the emblem of their mistress, who is the one who rules over the land of the aforesaid women. On June 7th, the eve of Corpus Christi, they took a small riverside village full of fish. The men begged to rest and celebrate, but Orellana hesitated. He knew small places often hid larger forces, and that night the village struck back under the moon. The Spaniards fought them off, posted guards, and left at dawn, hanging several prisoners as a warning. They kept moving downriver and soon reached a new region along a massive tributary they called the Rio Grande. The riverbanks rose with terraced villages and tall wooden posts called gibbets, the kind used to hang or display the condemned. The holy man Gaspar de Carvajal describes a very eerie scene. In this village there were 7 gibbets, which we saw were at certain distances apart from one another throughout the villages, and on these gibbets were nailed many dead men's heads. It was here that they captured a very smart girl that told them stories that sounded like a rumor at first. The story she told was that many Christians lived inland under a great lord who had brought them down the river. The Spaniards guessed these were the lost men from Diego de Ordaz's party, which had gone missing to the north of this region years before. They pushed deeper into the lower river, the land growing richer and the villages larger. The people they met spoke of powerful women who ruled far downstream, queens who commanded warriors and demanded tribute. When they reached the next stretch of river, they found out the stories weren't just talk, and Gaspar de Carvajal describes what he saw with his own eyes. There came as many as 10 or 12 of them, for we ourselves saw these women who were fighting in front of all the Indian men as women captains, and the latter fought so courageously that the Indian men did not dare to turn their backs, and anyone who did turn his backs they killed with clubs right there before us. These women are very white and tall, and have their hair very long and braided, and they are very robust and go about naked, but with their private parts covered, with their bows and arrows in their hands, doing as much fighting as 10 Indian men. And indeed there was one woman among these who shot an arrow a span deep into one of our brigantines, so that our brigantines looked like porcupines. Our Lord was pleased to give strength and courage to our companions, who killed 7 or 8 of the Amazons, whereupon the Indians lost heart, and they were defeated and routed with considerable damage to their persons. After the fight, they captured a man from this kingdom that the warrior women ruled. Through rough translations, he described what sounded like an entire kingdom run by women, 70 fortified towns connected by guarded roads where travelers paid tolls to enter. The women lived apart from the men, and once a year they rode to war against a nearby chief to seize men by force. When they became pregnant, they sent the men home unharmed. Male babies were returned or killed. Female children were kept and trained to fight. The ruler was a single queen named Conori, who held absolute power. In her capital stood 5 great temples to the sun, lined with painted wood and filled with gold and silver idols shaped like women. The priestesses wore fine wool clothing, woven blankets and cloaks fastened with cords. Their hair reached the ground, and gold crowns 2 fingers wide. The captured man said they owned herds of llamas, like those in Peru, and used them as pack animals. He spoke of salt lakes where the women gathered salt, and of rich farmland where they raised food and fruit. It was, he said, a powerful, disciplined civilization, wealthy, beautiful, and feared by every province around it. They drifted downstream and spotted a quiet village. The men begged to stop for food. Orellana warned it was a trap but gave in. Arrows exploded from the trees, one blinding the friar in the eye. Out of all of us in the village, they hit no one but me, for they planted an arrow shot right in one of my eyes, in such a way that the arrow went through to the other side, from which wound I had lost the eye, and even now I am not without suffering, and not free from pain, although our Lord, without my deserving it, has been kind enough to grant me life, so that I may mend my ways and serve him. Morning brought what looked like open country, but around the bend they saw the richest land yet, full of hills, villages, and people. A captured trumpeter said the region was ruled by Arepuna, a powerful chief whose land stretched far north toward a great lake. His people, he said, practiced cannibalism and held the lost Christians the Spaniards had heard about. 2 days later, they fought through 2 more towns for food. A poisoned arrow killed one of their men, and from then on, Orellana swore off landings unless there was no other choice. They survived on a little bit of maize until a dead tapir drifted by, meat enough for nearly a week. On Holy Savior's Day, they found a beach to rebuild the ships, this time with new masts and sails from vines and blankets, while living on snails and crabs. At the river's mouth, the locals were peaceful and unarmed, offering food and water. With no compass, no pilots, and no charts, they put their faith in Christ and steered for open seas. On August 26, they cleared the river's mouth, 50 leagues wide, its fresh water stretching far into the ocean, and sailed out under clear skies. They had sailed the entire length of the Amazon River. They navigated blind on the coast, sometimes seeing land, sometimes losing it. 2 days later, they reached Nueva Cadiz, a settlement on the island of Cubawa. Finding the smaller brigantine had arrived first. The joy was overwhelming. The people there took them in, fed them, and gave them supplies. From 1541 to 1542, what began as an expedition looking for cinnamon and gold turned into one of the most brutal survival stories in history. Gonzalo Pizarro left Quito with more than 4,000 men, both Spaniards and native porters, believing that they would find El Dorado or the land of cinnamon beyond the Andes. Instead, they found the Amazon, a world of endless jungles, flooded plains, disease, and starvation. Orellana returned to Spain, hailed as a discoverer of the world's greatest river, but his fame was short-lived. The crown sent him back to colonize it in 1544. The second voyage fell apart in disease, shipwrecks, and mutiny. Orellana died on the same river he discovered in 1546, reportedly of fever, the Amazon claiming him at last. But Gonzalo wasn't done yet. When the Spanish crown passed new laws to protect the indigenous people of Peru and cut off the conquistador's profits, Gonzalo's anger boiled over. His followers crowned him their leader, and for a brief moment, he ruled Peru as a rebel, even executing the king's viceroy in Lima's plaza. But it didn't last long. In 1548, royal forces surrounded him outside Cusco. His army surrendered without a fight. Gonzalo Pizarro was captured and beheaded on April 10, 1548. Only the holy man, Gaspar de Carvajal, lived long enough to record what had happened. His chronicles survived as the best eyewitness account of their struggle through the Amazon, and through it, the Europeans would first learn about this river, its civilizations, and the staggering death toll that carved it into European history. The bravest adventure of all time. 500 years ago, Ferdinand Magellan set out to do what no one had ever done before, sail around the world. Along the way, his men wrote that they met giants on the coast of Patagonia, so tall that the Spaniards said the biggest of them only came to their waist. They crossed an unknown ocean, starved for months, and watched their captain die in battle. Yet against all odds, his crew finished the voyage, the first circumnavigation in human history. In 1519, Spain and Portugal were the two major colonial powers in the world. Portugal already controlled the sea route to India and the Spice Islands by sailing east around Africa. Spain wanted to reach those same islands by sailing west across the Atlantic. That same year, Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico and began his campaign against the Aztec Empire. While Cortés was fighting on land in the New World, another Spanish-financed expedition was preparing to try something that had never been done before: cross the entire world. The man chosen to lead that expedition was Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese navigator who had a falling out with his own king. He offered his services to the Spanish crown, and the Emperor Charles V gave him command of 5 ships to find a western passage through South America and reach Asia. Antonio Pigafetta was an Italian scholar and explorer who joined Magellan's expedition around the world, and it will be the main primary source for this video. In August of 1519, 5 ships departed Seville, Spain, with just under 300 men of mixed nationalities. The fleet stopped at the Canary Islands for supplies and then crossed the equator. Sailors later reported glowing blue fire on the masts during a storm, an effect known as St. Elmo's fire. Eventually, they would sight the coast of Brazil near the modern Recife region. They anchored near the coast and traded with local people for food, parrots, and cotton cloth. Pigafetta noted that they were very generous, but he also mentioned reports of ritual cannibalism among the tribes. And in early 1520, they reached a wide river mouth where the sea turned to fresh water for miles. They were near the modern-day Uruguay and Argentina. Believing it might be a passage to the Pacific, they explored it briefly and named it Rio de la Plata, the River of Silver. Finding no exit to the Western Ocean, they turned around and kept heading south along the coast. By March of 1520, the ships entered a sheltered bay now called Puerto San Julián in Argentina, and it was here that they would spend the winter. The cold was severe, supplies were low, and tensions grew between Magellan and his Spanish captains. One of them, Juan de Cartagena, the royal inspector, was appointed by the emperor. Previously in the voyage, he had already been arrested for disobedience, but during the winter, he helped organize a rebellion to overthrow Magellan. One of his captains, Mendoza, was stabbed and killed. Another one, Quesada, was captured and executed, and Cartagena was marooned on the coast with a priest and never seen again. The remaining crews surrendered, and Magellan now ruled the fleet absolutely. As winter passed, the men explored the barren coast, and one day, a giant figure appeared on the beach, tall, painted, and dancing. The following is a very long quote that explains this very interesting encounter in detail. One day, without anyone expecting it, we saw a giant who was on the shore of the sea, quite naked, and was dancing and leaping and singing. Our captain sent one of his men towards him, who he charged to sing and leap like the giant to reassure him and show him that we were friends. This he did, and immediately the sailor led the giant to a little island where the captain was waiting for him. And when he was before us, he began to be astonished and to be afraid, and he raised one finger, thinking that we came from heaven. He was so tall that the tallest of us only came to his waist. However, he was well built. When he was brought before the captain, he was clothed with the skin of a certain beast. This beast has its head and ears of the size of a mule, and the neck and body of the fashion of a camel, the legs of a deer, and the tail like that of a horse, and it neighs like a horse. And he carried in his hand a short and thick bow, with a thick cord made of the gut of the said beast. The captain caused food and drink to be given to this giant. Then they showed him some things, amongst others a steel mirror. When the giant saw himself in the mirror, he was greatly terrified, leaping backwards, and made 3 or 4 of our men fall down. These giants came one after the other, all naked, and began to leap and sing, raising one finger to heaven, and showing to our people a certain white powder made of roots of herbs, which they kept in earthen pots, and they made signs that they lived on that, and that they had nothing else to eat than this powder. Therefore our people made signs to them to come to the ship, and that we would help them carry their bundles. Then these men came, who carried only their bows in their hands, but their wives came after them, laden like donkeys, and carried their goods. These women are not as tall as the men, but they are very sufficiently large. When we saw them, we were amazed and astonished. They brought with them 4 of these little beasts, of which they make their clothing, and they led them around with a cord in the manner of dogs coupled together. While Magellan's crew camped on the coast, they claimed to keep meeting with these so-called giants. One of them, friendlier than the rest, was tall enough that when he jumped, the ground shook beneath his feet. Pigafetta wrote that he learned to say Jesus, Ave Maria, and Juan, and was baptized under that name. 2 weeks later, 4 more giants appeared, and the Spaniards lured them back with trinkets, and then they captured 2 of them, putting shackles on them, with the intentions of taking them back to Spain as living curiosities. When the giants realized that the shackles were permanent, they roared with fury, shouting to their god, Setebos, for help. That name and the god of the giants, Setebos, would later be immortalized by Shakespeare in his work, The Tempest. The other giants would try to escape, and chaos broke out. The Spaniards fought with crossbows and guns, but the giants were incredibly fast, faster than horses, according to Pigafetta, and hard to hit. One Spaniard was killed by an arrow, after which the survivors burned the giants' camp. Pigafetta noted that the giants were fiercely protective of their wives, living as nomads in hide tents, and survived on raw meats and roots. He also recorded some interesting medical customs. When they were sick, they forced themselves to vomit by swallowing arrows. For headaches, they cut their own foreheads and limbs to let the bad blood out. Magellan called these people Patagonia, from which the name Patagonia comes. These men that Pigafetta called giants were likely the Tehuelche people of southern Patagonia. Many of these men averaged around 6 feet tall, noticeably larger than the average European sailor of the 1500s, and a lot taller than most natives throughout the Americas. However, the chronicler Antonio Pigafetta wrote that the tallest of us reached only to his waist. Whether he was exaggerating or the expedition really did encounter a 7-foot-plus giant human being remains one of history's greatest curiosities. Whatever they saw, the meeting left such an impression that for centuries afterwards, maps marked this region as the land of giants. By August 1520, the ice melted and the fleet prepared to sail again. They raised a wooden cross on the hill above Port San Julian, claiming the land for Spain, and continued south through the rough seas and freezing wind. In October of 1520, an opening was seen between 2 high cliffs. The channel ran deep and narrow with mountains capped in snow on both sides. Magellan named this the Cape of Virgins, after the feast day on which it was discovered. He ordered the fleet to enter. Strong tides swept them through twisting inlets, bordered by glaciers and dark forests of cypress and cedar. They dropped anchor where they could, tying thick ropes to trees because the water was too deep for anchors to hold. Magellan sent 2 ships, San Antonio and the Concepcion, ahead to look for an exit. When they disappeared for 2 days, everyone thought they were lost. Then on the 3rd day, they returned under full sail, firing cannons and shouting that they had found the way out into the western sea. The men cheered and wept with relief. Magellan named the farthest point Cape Desire. He had found the connection between the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. But one of the ships, the San Antonio, decided that they had had enough. Its Spanish crew, led by the pilot Estavo Gomez, refused to follow Magellan any further. Under the cover of darkness, they fled back through the straits and returned to Spain. Magellan never saw them again. After 38 days of navigation through the channel, the remaining 3 ships emerged into a calm, endless expanse of blue water. This was the Pacific Ocean. He had no idea how vast it really was. They sailed west for 3 months and 20 days without sighting land. There were no storms, but also no wind to push them and no ports to resupply. The food ran out. The crew ate old biscuits full of worms and drank yellow, foul-smelling water. They boiled strips of oxide from the rigging just to have something to chew. Rats on the ship became extremely valuable, and sickness started to spread. Pigafetta described men's gums swelling until they could not eat. 19 died and 20 more were crippled by scurvy. Those who survived could barely stand. Despite the misery, Magellan refused to turn back. He ordered daily prayers and promised that land could not be that far away, but the ocean stretched on without end. They had crossed what would later be recognized as nearly 1/3 of the planet's circumference. At night, the sky blazed with stars, unfamiliar to European eyes. Pigafetta noted a pattern of 5 bright points forming a cross, what we now call the Southern Cross constellation. It was one of the first written descriptions of it by the Europeans. By early March 1521, the men were near death when the lookout cried land. They had reached a small chain of islands in the western Pacific, the Mariana Islands near Guam. For the first time in months, they saw trees, birds, and people. Canoes would soon surround the ship. The islanders traded coconuts, bananas, and fished for bits of iron and cloth. But these people would soon steal one of their small boats. Magellan, desperate and furious, ordered a raid. His men burned several huts and killed a few of their islanders before recovering the boats. Pigafetta would later call this place the Island of Thieves. It was a harsh introduction to the Western Pacific, but it also meant survival. Fresh food and water revived the crew just enough to keep sailing. Magellan turned southwest, following his charts toward a group of larger islands ahead, the Philippines. In March of 1521, they sighted land again, Samar Island, part of the Philippine archipelago. The air was humid, but the people were friendly. After nearly 4 months of ocean and death, they'd completed the first crossing of the Pacific. They were still suffering from scurvy. Magellan ordered tents built on the beach for the sick, and the men began to recover. On March 31st, Easter Sunday, the expedition's priests led a celebration and the first Catholic Mass ever held in the Philippines. Both the Spaniards and the island's leaders attended, kneeling before a wooden cross. Cannons were fired from the ships in salute. The local rulers promised friendship and agreed to guide Magellan to a larger and wealthier island called Cebu. In April of 1521, the fleet entered the harbor of Cebu City. It was crowded with canoes and wooden houses built on stilts over the water. The island's king, Raja Humabon, first demanded a trading tax, which was a local custom. But Magellan's interpreter, a Malay man named Enrique, told him that the Spanish emperor sought friendship, not tribute. Gifts were exchanged and the two leaders became allies. In April of 1521, this island king, his queen, and more than 800 islanders were baptized into Christianity. The king took a new name, Don Carlos, after the Spanish emperor, and the queen was named Juana. Magellan presented her with a small statue of the Christ child, a gift that would later become the famous Santo Niño of Cebu. For a brief time, everything went perfectly. The Spaniards believed they had found loyal allies, seeing themselves as both explorers and missionaries. But across the channel from Cebu was Mactan Island, ruled by a local chief named Lapu-Lapu. He refused to recognize their authority or to accept Spanish control. When Magellan heard this, he decided to make an example of him. In April of 1521, 60 heavily armed Spaniards landed on the beach of Mactan. The tide was low, forcing them to wade through shallows before they could reach land, and waiting for them were more than 1,000 island warriors. Arrows and bamboo spears started to rain down. The Spaniards' muskets and crossbows fired, but the range was too short to stop the charge. Magellan ordered the huts to be burned to frighten the enemy, but the winds carried the flames the wrong way. The islanders counterattacked, focusing on the unprotected legs of the armored men. A spear would strike Magellan in the leg, and he stumbled. Soon another blow hit his arm, and a sword cut deep into his thigh. Moments later, he was struck down in the surf. Magellan's journey was over, dead at the age of 41. The survivors burned one of the vessels, the Concepcion, because there was too few men to sail it. 2 ships remained, the Trinidad and Victoria. Of the 265 men that had left Spain, only 120 were still alive. They crossed the equator again and steered toward eastern Indonesia. These were the Spice Islands that had been their goal from the beginning. In November of 1521, the ships dropped anchor at Tidore, one of the volcanic islands in eastern Indonesia. The local ruler, Sultan al-Mansur, welcomed them warmly. He said that he had a dream that white-winged ships would come from the west. For the exhausted Spaniards, it was a miracle. They had finally arrived where the world's most valuable spices grew. They collected cloves, nutmeg, and cinnamon, trading everything they had left, cloth, iron, and even ship parts for the spices. Pigafetta wrote that 10 yards of cloth could buy 400 pounds of cloves. The air of the island smelled of wood smoke and spice. But the Trinidad, Magellan's flagship, began to leak badly. Her timbers, eaten by shipworms, could no longer hold pressure. After failing to repair the boat, the crew decided to leave her behind for overhaul, while the smaller ship Victoria sailed home. They set out westward across the Indian Ocean, carrying 26 tons of cloves, worth more than the entire cost of the voyage. The Victoria sailed west under constant threat of storms and Portuguese patrols. They could not stop at any port, since Portugal claimed all the lands along the route. The crew steered deep into the open ocean, taking a southerly course toward the Cape of Good Hope. Half the crew died of starvation and exhaustion. Those who survived rationed rice by the spoonful and collected rainwater from the cells. But by May of 1522, they had rounded the Cape, the first ship in history to circle the globe that far. They eventually reached the Cape Verde Islands off of West Africa, a Portuguese colony. They were out of food, and they decided to risk a landing. A small boat was sent ashore, disguised as a Portuguese trading vessel to buy rice and meat. But when local officials realized that this was Magellan's ship, they arrested the people on shore. The Victoria immediately fled under full sail, leaving 13 men captured behind. With barely enough crew to steer the boat, they continued north toward home. And in September of 1522, after almost 3 years at sea, the Victoria reached Spain. The masts were barely standing, the whole of the ship was covered in black mold, the sails were torn. 265 men departed Spain to cross the entire world. Only 18 Europeans and 3 Asian crewmen were still alive, completing the first circumnavigation of Earth. The survivors eventually reached Seville. They walked barefoot into the church of Santa Maria de la Victoria, each carrying a candle, and gave thanks for their survival. Behind them, dock workers unloaded the cargo, 381 sacks of cloves. That single load repaid every debt of the expedition and proved that the planet could indeed be circled. The Victoria's surviving captain, Juan Sebastian Elcano, and the chronicler Antonio Pigafetta were received by Emperor Charles V. Pigafetta later presented the emperor with his written accounts of the voyage, an extraordinary first-hand record that described everything from the giants of Patagonia to the death of Magellan. The expedition had taken 3 years and covered more than 42,000 miles. Though Magellan never lived to complete it, his vision and leadership made it possible. The sailors had proved to humanity that the entire globe was linked by a continuous ocean. Cabeza de Vaca suffered for 8 years what few men in history could imagine. Shipwrecked, enslaved, and stripped of every comfort of civilization, he walked barefoot across an unknown continent, clothed in rags, sustained only by faith and by the fragile hope that somewhere beyond the horizon, his God and his country still remembered his name. Along the way, he became a wandering miracle healer, curing the dying with his breath and the sign of the cross. His legend spread across the land like fire. The story of how he got here is truly remarkable. It all started in 1527 when a Spanish fleet set out to claim new lands. Cabeza de Vaca would be the treasurer of this expedition, a cautious and pragmatic man with a deep Catholic faith, yet before a single sail was raised, a Moorish woman gave a chilling prophecy. She warned one of the officers' wives that the voyage would end in ruin, that none would make it back, and if any man did, it would only be by the miracle of God. When the ships departed, she told the wives left behind to remarry and forget about their husbands, for they were never coming home. On June 27, 1527, Captain Narvaez set sail under royal orders. His mission was to conquer and govern the vast lands between the River Palmas and the Cape of Florida. His fleet numbered 5 ships and around 600 men, soldiers, sailors, and officers. Their first stop was in Santo Domingo on the island of Hispaniola, where they lingered for 45 days gathering supplies. From there, they sailed to Cuba, where the governor sought more provisions. Cabeza de Vaca and Captain Pantoja were sent ahead to collect supplies, but their mission ended in disaster. As a tropical storm gathered strength, the sea rose, and the sky blackened. Once inland, it turned into a hurricane, striking with unimaginable fury. The town and its churches collapsed. The wind was snapping trees like toothpicks. By morning, the sea had swallowed the fleet. On Monday morning, we went down to the harbor, but did not find the ships. We knew the ships were lost, and we walked along the shore to see if anything could be found of them. We found the little boat of a ship lodged upon some trees. 2 bodies were found belonging to my ship, and some lids of boxes. But the persons were so disfigured by beating against the rocks that they could not be recognized. Months later, when Narvaez finally reached them, he brought with him a new brigantine and a new pilot, a man who swore he knew the northern coast and the River Palmas well. Trusting him, the governor gathered 400 men and 80 horses aboard 4 ships, and the brigantine set sail again. But as they turned south toward Havana, another storm rose up from the southeast, and they were at the mercy of ocean currents and its wind. When it finally ended, they found themselves cast upon an unknown coast, the wild shores of Florida. There on April 12, 1528, they dropped anchor by the modern-day Tampa Bay. They entered a village and traded with nearby natives for fish and venison. De Vaca wrote about a gigantic communal house that could hold 300 people, and among the scattered nets they found a single gold trinket, a spark that fed their hopes of riches. Narvaez raised Spain's standard and claimed the coast for Emperor Charles. Only 42 horses survived the storm and hunger. The natives returned, motioning for the strangers to leave. With no interpreter, there was only silence and warning gestures. Despite their situation, they were still hungry for gold, and Narvaez led 40 men north along the bay, Cabeza de Vaca among them. They captured 4 guides who led them to a small maize village. Inside were Spanish chests filled with desiccated bodies wrapped in painted deer hides. It appeared that these bodies of unknown Spaniards were being worshipped as idols, and the friars had them burned. The natives spoke of Appalachian, a land rich in gold. Against Vaca's warning, Narvaez marched inland, leaving the ships behind. It was this choice that would doom them all. On May 1st, 1528, Narvaez abandoned the ships and marched inland with 300 men. 40 of them were mounted, but their horses were very weak. Each soldier carried only 2 pounds of biscuits and half a pound of bacon. For 15 days they wandered through endless forests, finding nothing to eat but bitter shoots of palmetto. They finally reached a large river that they crossed on makeshift rafts against a rough current, before stumbling upon a native village rich with maize, their first real food in weeks. Despite De Vaca cautioning against going further, Narvaez pressed forward toward the rumored land of the gold that the natives had spoke of. And this march was brutal. They waded through rivers, swamps, and forests, all while getting pounded by thunderstorms. 1 horseman drowned crossing a river. They were being guided by a local chief, and they finally reached the village of Appalachian. They found only women and children. It was oddly quiet, and before long, arrows started to rain down on them, killing a horse. The village warriors had returned and quickly scattered back to the forest. They dealt with these on and off again attacks for days. Inside the settlement, they discovered maize in abundance and deer hides. The village itself was small. The Spaniards saw many animals, deer, bear, and critters with a pouch that carried its young, their first glimpse of a possum. But it became very apparent that there was little gold to be found here. Their guide would inform them that this disappointing village of Appalachian was actually the richest town of the region, and that beyond that, it stretched only wilderness, swamps, and scattered tribes. Desperate for food and safety, Narvaez decided to turn south to a village called Aute, said to have maize, beans, and fish. Throughout their entire march there, they faced an invisible enemy firing through the trees. A nobleman was killed, and the wounded groaned throughout the nights. When they finally reached Aute after 9 days, they found only ashes and empty huts. They set up camp here, many of the men very sick. They faced constant attack, and the dream of conquest was fading into a fight for survival. How could they possibly escape this cursed land? And the answer was to build boats and take to the sea. They had no nails or tools, and not one man skilled in shipbuilding. Yet desperation gave them ingenuity. A soldier fashioned bellows from wood and deerskin. Nails were hammered from spurs and stirrups. Sails were sewn from shirts. Ropes were twisted from horsehair. The only carpenter among them led the work, and after months of hunger and struggle, by September 20th, 5 crude crafts were ready, each to carry about 40 men each. They killed the last of their horses for food, stripping their hides for water skins, and twisting their manes into ropes. When the final animal was slain, The men wept openly, for the horses had carried them through storms and swamps since Spain. In remembrance of their sacrifice, they named this place the Bay of Horses. Before we embarked, there died more than 40 men of disease and hunger, without enumerating those destroyed by the Indians. By the 22nd of the month of September, the horses had been consumed, only one remaining, and on that day we embarked. The boats were so crowded that we could not move. They waded waist deep through shallows, lost sight of the coast, and drifted 7 days before reaching an island. There they seized canoes and found dried mullet and roe, the first food in days. It was now 5 days since we had drunk. Our thirst was so excessive that it put us to the extremities of swallowing salt water, by which some of the men became so crazed that 3 or 4 suddenly died. When they finally reached calmer shores, friendly natives met them with pitchers of water and cooked fish, but that night the natives attacked, wounding Narvaez in the face. The Spaniards fought through darkness, every man hurt, before driving the attackers away, taking 2 captives with them. The next day they burned the enemy's canoes for warmth, and 3 days later they sailed on, still starving, still praying. A Greek sailor went ashore with Indians to fetch water, and he never returned. Days later, storms and hunger tore the fleet apart. Narvaez's faster boat broke away despite Cabeza de Vaca pleading to stay together. Each must do what he thinks best to save his life, Narvaez said before vanishing into the surf, never to be seen again. For 4 days, Vaca's boat drifted, all the men half dead, collapsing from hunger and cold. Only he and the pilot had enough strength to row. Nearly dawn, a massive wave flung them ashore, their bodies scattered in the shallows. Crawling to safety, they kindled a fire, roasted a little maize, and drank rainwater. Cabeza de Vaca sent one man, Lope de Oviedo, the strongest among them, to climb a tree and survey the land. He returned saying it looked like a pasture land, as if cattle had roamed there, a hopeful sign they might be near Christians. When he returned, 3 natives followed him to the shore, soon joined by hundreds more with bow and arrows. The starving Spaniards could barely stand, much less fight. Cabeza de Vaca and the royal assessor went forward to meet the warriors, offering beads and trinkets and peace. The natives accepted, giving arrows in return, a sign of friendship, and promised to return with food the next morning. At dawn, the natives returned as promised, bringing heaps of fish and roots pulled from beneath the water. At last, the Spaniards felt strong enough to try the sea again, and after digging out their buried boat, the men pushed it into the sea. 2 waves struck, one soaking them, the next flipping the raft. 3 drowned, and the survivors crawled ashore half dead, their boats and clothes lost. At sunset, the natives returned with more food, only to find the strangers nearly dead. Seeing the corpses of the drowned men, they began to cry. Moved by compassion, they carried the survivors to their village. Along the way, they built fires to keep them warm, and by nightfall, they had built a shelter with flames and food. The natives danced and rejoiced and welcomed them. The Spaniards rested and regained their strength. One day, Cabeza de Vaca noticed some Spanish items that they were wearing that he did not give to them. This is a clue that others like him were nearby. He sent 2 natives and 2 of his own men to investigate, and before long they returned with astounding news. There were more survivors. It was Captain Andres Dorantes and Alonso del Castillo, with the crew of another lost boat. The reunion was bittersweet, joy at seeing one another alive, but grief at the sight of each other's condition. With winter coming and no way forward, they had no choice but to stay on the island. This area was near the modern-day Galveston, Texas. 4 of the strongest, which included a man named Figueroa, had volunteered to swim and walk westward toward Panuco to seek rescue. They left with a single native guide carrying the last hope of the Narvaez expedition. On the island of misfortune, the natives decided that the starving Spaniards should become physicians, whether they wished for it or not. Among these people, healing was done by breath and touch. They blew upon the sick, laid hands on them, and believed illness could be drawn out and cast away. When Cabeza de Vaca and his companions refused, insisting they knew nothing about medicine, the natives simply stopped feeding them until they agreed. They finally decided to give it a shot, and de Vaca tells a remarkable story. Our method was to bless the sick, breathing upon them and praying to God our Lord that He would give health and influence them to make us some good return. In His clemency, He willed that all those who we supplicated should tell the others that they were sound and in health, directly after we made the sign of the blessed cross over them. For this, the Indians treated us kindly. They deprived themselves of food that they might give to us. According to de Vaca, their prayers had worked, and word started to spread among the natives. Even with their growing popularity, starvation still shadowed them. Cabeza de Vaca sometimes went 3 days without food, surviving only on prayer. The tribal people, the Capoques and the Hans, were enduring the same misery. There just wasn't much food to go around. After Dorantes and Castillo rejoined the others, only 14 Spaniards remained alive, but many of them would soon die. Cabeza de Vaca, gravely ill and stranded on the mainland, could not join them. Soon he found himself enslaved by islanders, forced to dig roots in icy waters until his fingers bled. When he could bear this life no longer, he escaped to the mainland tribes, surviving as a wandering trader. Carrying seashells and beads, he bartered along the coast for food and shelter. His reputation grew and every village welcomed him for his goods. But for nearly 6 years he lived impoverished among them, always seeking a way to rejoin his countrymen. But at last, one day, he would encounter another Spaniard. It was Lope de Oviedo from the island. Most were dead, murdered, or starved. Only 3 still lived: Castillo, Dorantes, and the Moor, Estevanico. Broken by fear and exhaustion, the 2 men went their separate ways, trying to survive. Cabeza de Vaca pressed on alone into the wilderness. But 2 days later, he would run into these 3 survivors. The tribes who held them had come inland to gather walnuts, their only food for months. A native who pitied Cabeza de Vaca helped him slip away through the woods to meet them. When Dorantes saw him, he was struck speechless. They had long believed Cabeza de Vaca was dead. The reunion was overwhelming, 4 broken men thanking God through tears for being alive. They decided to wait 6 months until the tribes moved south for the prickly pear season. This fruit, blood red and sweet, was the only food for 3 months every year. In the meantime, Cabeza de Vaca, struggling to hang on, became a slave again, occasionally meeting with the Spaniards when their masters would cross paths. He learned the full horror of what had become of Narvaez's lost boat. Stories carried mouth to mouth across the coast. A man named Esquivel lasted the longest, surviving by cutting and drying the flesh of a dead Spaniard until natives found and enslaved him. Later, he would be killed after a woman dreamed he would harm her son, a dream that sealed his fate. 3 times Cabeza de Vaca would try to flee his masters, and 3 times they hunted him down, trying to kill him. Each time, by what he called the mercy of God, he survived. When the season of prickly pears returned, they reunited, Dorantes, Castillo, Estevanico, and Vaca, all in the same region, where they planned their escape once more. But their masters would move again before they could flee, driving the groups apart. Vaca told his companions he would wait among the prickly pear groves until the full moon, then go alone if they did not come. When the time came, Dorantes and Estevanico appeared, saying they knew Castillo was nearby. They gorged themselves on the juice of the prickly pears, their thirst never fully quenched. And on the 2nd day after moving camp, the 4 survivors entrusted themselves to God and fled at last. By evening, they saw smoke rising in the distance and followed it, finding a friendly native who led them to his people. A new tribe who spoke a different tongue, but they knew of the healers and their miracles. They welcomed the strangers joyfully, bringing them prickly pears and food. That night, for the first time in years, the wanderers slept in peace. The natives soon came to Castillo and de Vaca, complaining of terrible head pain. He asked for them to heal him. After he made over them the sign of the cross and commended them to God, they instantly said that all the pain had left, and went to their houses, bringing us prickly pears, with a piece of venison, a thing to us little known. As the report of Castillo's performances spread, many came to us that night sick, that we should heal them, each bringing a piece of venison, until the quantity became so great we knew not where to dispose of it. We gave many thanks to God, for every day went on increasing his compassions and his gifts. After the sick were attended to, they began to dance and sing, making themselves festive until sunrise. And because of our arrival, the rejoice continued for 3 days. At sunrise, more natives arrived, carrying 5 people, crippled and near death. Castillo prayed over them, making the sign of the cross, and by morning time, all rose up, healed and strong. The miracles filled the tribe with awe, and for the Spaniards, it rekindled faith that God had not abandoned them. Word of these cures spread rapidly. Tribes from every direction came seeking healing. When summoned to treat another group, Cabeza de Vaca went himself. One man appeared already dead, eyes rolled back, pulse gone. Vaca prayed and breathed over him, and by the next day, the man was walking and eating again. The natives started referring to them as children of the sun, believing that they could raise the dead. Committing themselves to God, they took leave of the natives, who showed them the path toward another tribe nearby that spoke a similar language. Not long after, they saw 2 women and some boys walking in the woods. After some signs of peace, the natives came forward and led them to their dwellings, about 50 houses in all. Cabeza de Vaca describes some similar customs that all these tribes shared. When a woman became pregnant, her husband refrained from sleeping with her until 2 years after the child's birth. Children were nursed until the age of 12, since famine was so frequent. The mother's milk often kept them alive when food was scarce. If a person fell sick and could not travel, the tribes left them behind to die, except in the case of a son or a brother, whom they would carry on their back. Men without children changed wives freely, while those with families remained faithful. The natives kept constant watch when danger was near. All night they lay awake with bows beside them, creeping silently from their huts to study every sound and shadow. As the Spaniards moved on, they now had native followers believing in their miracles, and they started to see a troubling pattern. Each new tribe welcomed them kindly, but the natives that were with the Spaniards plundered their host homes, leaving nothing behind. The victims remarkably consoled them, saying their loss was worth it for the honor of seeing the children of the sun. When a native with an arrowhead lodged near his heart was brought to them, Cabeza de Vaca cut open his chest and removed it. The man recovered the next day without pain, and word of the miracle spread across the region, winning the healers even greater reverence. Their company sometimes grew to thousands, and the people refused to eat or drink until the four had blessed their food. The travelers crossed dry, rugged mountains and a deep river before reaching fertile plains, where the sick recovered and the people showed great obedience. They discovered settled villages with houses, beans, pumpkins, and maize, the first real signs of agriculture since Florida. They rejoiced and thanked God. In one town, the people gave Dorantes more than 600 deer hearts, and the Spaniards named it the Town of Hearts. The explorers found a sword belt buckle and a horseshoe nail on a native, proof of other Christians. The natives informed them that bearded men with horses and lances had passed through. The Spaniards thanked God, but as they moved on, they saw the devastation those men had caused, burning towns, enslaving families, and many people were hiding in fear. Near the mountains, they found traces of gold, copper, and iron, and at last the tracks of horsemen. After years of wandering, they had reached the edge of the Spanish conquest, and after 10 leagues, he encountered 4 Spaniards on horseback, who stared in disbelief at his ragged appearance. Cabeza de Vaca told them that Castillo and Dorantes were nearby with a large following, and Alcaraz sent riders to bring them in. Their long captivity was finally over. But when Alcaraz tried to enslave the natives, anger erupted. Cabeza de Vaca was not happy with this, for he owed his life to these native people. But really, there was nothing much he could do. The 4 survivors were sent to Culiacan, in the modern-day state of Sinaloa, and once again almost died of thirst along the way. In 1536, the 4 reached Mexico City, welcomed with honor by the viceroy, and after 2 months' rest, Cabeza de Vaca sailed back to Spain, ending his 8-year journey across the land and sea. Before this voyage had begun, a Moorish woman had prophesied a disaster. Her words were proven true. Of the 600 who left Spain, only 4 returned alive: Castillo, Dorantes, Estevanico, and Cabeza de Vaca. It's the year 1504 in Jamaica. Christopher Columbus's final voyage has turned into a disaster. His ships lie broken on the coast, and his men are starving. Months of hardship have left them diseased and desperate. They beg the islanders for food, and their pleas are met with silence. Facing ruin, Columbus turns to the sky. Summoning the local chiefs, he gestures to the heavens, and he warns them that his God is angry, and soon he will show a sign. That night, as the moon climbs the sky, the prophecy takes shape. A shadow creeps across its face. The light fades until the moon burns dark red. Terror spreads across the island. The natives bring food and water. The starving Spaniards devour it in desperation. By turning to the heavens, Columbus had saved his men. Using calculations and his knowledge of the moon cycles, he correctly predicted a lunar eclipse. This wouldn't be the first time that Columbus almost died in these foreign lands, but first we need to tell the story of how he got here. This video is not meant to be a moral authority on whether Columbus was a brave man or a demon. There's plenty of videos out there that you can watch that cover that part. Instead, this will be a narrative review of the first-hand accounts of the 4 voyages that Columbus made. In the late 15th century, sailors told of strange carved wood drifting across the Azores, of unfamiliar bodies washing up on beaches, causing a few to speculate that land might be far to the west. Scholars agreed the Earth was a globe, but no one knew just how far it stretched. Marco Polo's tales of the riches of Asia still burned in the imagination of Europe, and yet spices, silk, and gold grew ever more costly, taxed at every stop along the overland routes from the east. Whoever found a new path would control a fortune. Christopher Columbus, the son of a weaver from Genoa, was drawn to the sea in his youth. While Columbus is traditionally said to have been born in Genoa, his true origins remain debated. One interesting theory holds that he was actually a Spanish Jewish converso who concealed his ancestry to avoid persecution under the Catholic monarchs during the Inquisition. Supporters point to his vague early life, missing birth records, use of Castilian Spanish, and even Hebrew phrases in his writings as evidence. By his teens, he was sailing on merchant ships, traveling on the coast of Africa, and perhaps as far as Iceland. For a time, he made his base on the Portuguese island of Madeira in the Atlantic. It was there that he watched Portugal inch closer and closer to discovering a new route to Asia on the southern tip of Africa, a route that would bypass the Muslim trade roads, unlocking immense wealth. Columbus envisioned a different path. After years of studying maps and hearing of strange objects drifting in the western seas, he became convinced that Asia could be reached by sailing straight across the Atlantic. Portugal was uninterested. Rejected there, Columbus then turned to Spain. The kingdom was still reshaping itself after centuries of war. Their Portuguese rivals threatened to seize the east by way of Africa. Spain needed a bold gamble of its own. Yet the court was distracted. After centuries of Muslim rule, the Reconquista had ended, but new tensions were rising. The church itself was full of corruption, and Isabella's eyes turned toward the conversos, Jews who had converted under pressure, yet were still suspected of secretly clinging to their old practices. In 1478, she established the Spanish Inquisition. While the Inquisition spread terror at home, Isabella and Ferdinand pursued the conquest of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain, with the Queen herself present near the battlefields. Even as Isabella worked to root out Jewish and Muslim influence, her crown's finances leaned heavily on men of Jewish heritage. Luis de Santangel, a Jewish converso and treasurer of Aragon, would become instrumental in backing Columbus's westward voyage, Jewish money helping launch Spain's global empire at the very moment that Jewish life in Spain was being dismantled. Columbus lingered in Spain for years, facing skepticism and personal hardships, but meanwhile he was cultivating allies. Among them were Juan Perez, a friar close to the Queen, and Luis de Santangel, the wealthy Jewish converso and royal treasurer. Just as he was about to give up, these two allies of Columbus would convince Isabella that this was a good idea. They helped finance the venture, and Columbus would be given a blank check of authority to gather any resources he needed. Imprisoned men were granted clemency so long as they agreed to join his expedition. In the summer of 1492, Columbus outfitted 3 ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and Nina. As he prepared to sail, Spain would expel all unconverted Jews. 40,000 Jews fled the kingdom, and Columbus set sail west into uncharted waters. They stopped at the Canary Islands for repairs and to stock up on food, before turning west into the unknown Atlantic. For over 5 weeks they sailed without sight of land. Strange anomalies with the compass left them sailing blind for a period of time. But at last, near midnight on October 11th, the Pinta signaled land ahead. This moment was recorded by Bartolomeu de las Casas. A sailor named Rodrigo from Triana was the first to see land. The admiral, however, standing on the sterncastle at 10 o'clock, had also seen a light, although it was so faint that he couldn't say whether it might indicate land. He called Pedro Gutierrez, steward of the king's table, telling him that he thought he had seen a light and asked him to look. He looked and saw it. The admiral then called Rodrigo Sanchez from Segovia, whom the king and queen had sent with the fleet as an overseer. He could see no light because he was in a bad position to see it. But after the admiral spoke, the light could be seen once or twice, like a small candle being lifted up. Although few thought it meant land, the admiral was certain they were near land. 2 hours after midnight, land could be made out about 2 leagues away. They'd reached the small island of Lucayos in the Bahamas. People that wore hardly any clothes came out, and the Spaniards headed to shore. The admiral took with him the royal standard, and the captains the 2 banners with the green cross, which the admiral carried on all of his vessels. On shore they saw very green trees, a lot of water, and various kinds of fruits. The admiral summoned the 2 captains and the others who had come ashore, and he ordered them to bear faithful witness that he was taking possession before all assembled, which he did, of this island for the king and queen. Columbus believed all these lands as a detour, thinking he was getting closer to Japan and China. He started documenting all of this in his letters that he intended for the queen to read. He described that the islanders were friendly and generous, eagerly trading parrots, cotton, and food for trinkets like beads and bells. Convinced they had no religion, he told the queen that they could easily be converted and even taken as what he called servants. He observed their dugout canoes and their seamanship, and when he saw small pieces of gold worn as ornaments, he immediately pressed them for where it came from. He seized several islanders to serve as interpreters and captives. A few of my sailors went after them on shore, but they fled like hens. We took their dugout aboard Nina. All of these islands are so green and beautiful that I don't know where to go first. My eyes never tire of looking upon this gorgeous greenery, so different from what we have at home. I believe there are many plants and trees here that would be very useful in Spain as dyes and medicinal spices, but it pains me not to be able to identify them. Arriving off this cape, I noted the most divinely sweet odor of flowers and trees coming off the land, the very sweetest odors on earth. Columbus's captives told him of two great islands, one of them being Colba, or the modern-day Cuba. These reports fed his conviction that he was near Asia, not a new continent. While exploring near a lagoon, Columbus and his men spotted a reptile, likely an iguana. When it darted into the shallow waters, they chased it down with spears to kill it, and planned to send its skin back to the queen as a curiosity from this strange land. Columbus also collected aloe, which he believed valuable, and he ordered half a ton brought aboard. Later they would approach a nearby village, its inhabitants fleeing as they saw the Spaniards. Columbus told his men not to loot, and he coaxed them back with beads and bells, eventually persuading them to fetch gourds of fresh water for the fleet. In late October 1492, Columbus thought he reached Japan. It was actually the coast of Cuba. He sent a landing party inland to find a king and deliver letters from Ferdinand and Isabella, even bringing along a linguist who was familiar with biblical and Eastern languages. While awaiting their return, he careened his ships and continued seizing captives, still convinced he was on the threshold of Asia. Yesterday, a dugout with 6 men came alongside the flagship and 5 of them came aboard. I ordered them detained, since I planned to bring them back with me. I later sent to a house on the western bank of the river, and they brought 7 women, young and old, and 3 boys. I seized these women because the men I'm bringing to Spain will behave better if they have their own women with them than if they go without. After leaving Cuba, Columbus sighted the mountains of Hispaniola, which he again thought might be Japan. The fertile land and friendly people impressed him, especially when a young cacique arrived with 200 attendants and pieces of gold ornaments. The people of this land were the Tainos. On Christmas Eve, disaster struck when the Santa Maria ran aground. Though the ship was lost, Columbus turned misfortune into opportunity. With the help and generosity of the local chief, who wept at their loss and guarded their goods with care, he established the first Spanish foothold, La Navidad, leaving 40 men with provisions, tools, and weapons. When he wrote to the king to tell about this, he stated, "I can tell your highness that nowhere in Castile would better care be taken of our things, of which not a shoelace was missing." The return voyage almost ended in tragedy. In February 1493, they ran into some severe storms. Columbus feared his discovery would be lost and his children forgotten, but the Nina survived, and in March he sailed back to Spain. He paraded 7 of these natives through the streets of different Spanish cities, displaying them to curious onlookers. All of this was enough to secure the crown's support for another voyage, and to mark the beginning of Spain's empire in the New World. After consulting with the Pope, the crown would attempt to make the safety and well-being of the native populations a top priority. That safety and well-being of the natives would be very difficult to enforce clear across the world. Columbus would soon set sail again, this time with 17 vessels and 1,200 men. They made landfall by November of 1493 at the island of Dominica, and then eventually sailed to the nearby island of Guadeloupe. It was here that they encountered the Carib people, the cannibals that the Tainos people had warned them about. Dr. Diego Chanca describes what he witnessed. These people raid other islands, taking any women they can find, especially young, beautiful girls, who they keep for their service and hold as concubines. They take so many that in 50 houses we saw no males, and more than 20 of the captives were girls. These women say that they are treated with what seems to be unbelievable cruelty, and that their captors devour the male babies they have by them, bringing up only the babies of their own women. The men who they capture, they take to their houses, then butcher and eat them, saying there is nothing in this world like the flesh of a man. It looks like they believe this because of the bones we found in these houses. Everything that could have been gnawed was gnawed. Whatever was left simply too tough to be eaten. In one house we found a human neck boiling in a pot. The Spaniards would take some of these boys as well as some young teenage girls back to Spain with them to, quote, present them to the king as a sample. As they sailed around nearby islands, capturing more Caribs, one group decided to fight back, shooting arrows at the strange men. This went on for some time until they wounded their leader with a lance. This scene is described by Miquel de Sueno. Since we judged this Carib's wound to be fatal, we threw him overboard, but to our surprise, he suddenly began to swim away. We therefore recaptured him, and with the grappling hook dragged him over the ship's rail and hacked off his head with an axe. The other Caribs and slaves were later sent back to Spain. While in the boat, I captured an extremely beautiful Carib woman, who the admiral later gave to me. I took her with me to my quarters. She was naked according to their custom, and I conceived a desire to have my way with her. When Columbus's fleet reached Hispaniola in 1493, the mood was confident. He had left behind a small garrison of 39 men at the settlement of La Navidad during his first voyage. They were meant to guard Spain's claim, win the friendship of the Taino, and prepare for the larger colony to come. What he found instead was devastation. The fort had been burned to the ground, the houses destroyed, and every last Spaniard was dead. The story spread quickly. The men had abused native women, plundered resources, and provoked the local cacique. The Taino people rose up and overwhelmed the small outpost and wiped it from existence. Columbus quickly founded a new settlement on the north coast. La Isabela would be the first permanent European town in the Americas, but almost from the start it proved to be a disaster. The harbor was shallow and poor, the land was swampy and disease-ridden, Spanish crops failed to grow, forcing the colonists to rely on dwindling supplies from the Taino, whose goodwill had already worn thin. Soon hunger, dysentery, and fevers and scurvy would spread through the colony. Many men were too weak to work. Determined to salvage the mission, Columbus would march inland to search for gold. The expedition reached a fertile valley, dotted with streams carrying flecks of gold dust. Roads were carved through the wilderness and forts were raised to impose control. Resistance came swiftly, and the same cacique who had destroyed La Navidad organized attacks. In 1494, he took to the sea again. It was during this time he discovered the island of Jamaica, describing it as fertile and green. But storms battered his fleet, food ran low, and morale sank even lower. Every step forward seemed to deepen the colony's misery. By 1495, La Isabela was collapsing. Disease and famine ravaged the settlement. A hurricane tore through the town, reducing its fragile houses to ruins. Desperate for tribute, Columbus ordered that every Taino adult must deliver a quota of gold or cotton to the Spanish. Those who failed were punished. By 1496, this experiment with colonization was falling apart. Columbus was too distracted with his fantasy of finding the Emperor of China rather than maintaining and organizing a successful colony. His men were demoralized, insubordinate, and sick, and the vast wealth he had promised to Spain was nowhere to be found. During this time, a settlement named Santo Domingo would be raised, which is now the capital of the modern Dominican Republic. In March of 1496, he gathered what strength remained and sailed back to Spain. He carried some gold and cotton, a few exotic plants and animals, and captured 550 natives, many of them dying on the voyage home. When he arrived in June, his reputation was already in question. Upon arrival, the crown expressed its displeasure with the captured natives being brought to Spain, under the guise of servants. But despite all this, the crown noticed that Columbus had discovered something remarkable. Still unsure what this new land was, the king and queen granted more voyages. 3 ships were to provide provisions to the colonies at Hispaniola, and 3 ships were to go with Columbus to explore. They went further south this time. By the summer of 1498, Columbus's 3rd voyage was near exhaustion. The ships creaked under the rolling waves, and wine caskets were split. The crew was dangerously thirsty. Trade winds carried them toward unknown places, and on July 31st, the lookouts saw land. They found water and took the chance to recover their strength. To the south, faint on the horizon, stretched what we now know as Venezuela, a new continent that had been discovered, but they did not quite know it yet. They continued to sail until they encountered canoes with well-armed men. Columbus tried to lure them closer with gifts, then with music and dancing, but the meeting quickly turned violent. The islanders shot arrows and Spaniards returned fire with crossbows, and the canoes scattered back to shore. For days, Columbus tested the strong currents of the Gulf, watching the ebbs and flow of a river so powerful that the sea itself seemed to change. Then came terror. On August 4th, during the dead of the night, the crews heard a deafening roar. The ocean rose in a mountain of water, bearing down on their ships. Columbus confessed that he feared the wave would break them apart, but the surge passed harmlessly beneath the keels, and when dawn broke, the fleet continued north, astonished but alive. Columbus started to note anomalous compass readings. The needle was drifting in a way that his pilots couldn't explain. He convinced himself he was sailing upon a bulge of the globe. In a letter to the crown, he wrote that the earth was not perfectly round, but pear-shaped, with the protuberance near the equator, higher and closer to the heavens, and that this elevated region might be where the great rivers of the world rise, perhaps even the earthly paradise. Unfortunately for Columbus, his health started to fade, and his eyesight was poor and he was in constant pain. He claimed he didn't sleep for more than 30 days, and scholars believe these were symptoms of a bacterial infection he probably got from eating foul food. By 1500, reports of misrule and mismanagement of the expedition had reached Spain. The monarchs dispatched Francisco de Bobadilla, a royal commissioner who was sent to restore order. Bobadilla arrived at Santo Domingo, immediately took command, and ordered Columbus arrested. Christopher Columbus was put in shackles and taken back to Spain. It was humiliation beyond belief, and he later wrote to the Queen about what he thought was an injustice. But when he arrived to Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella ordered his chains be taken off immediately. They pardoned him and promised him respect, but they did not restore his governorship. The crown had taken the New World out of Columbus's hands. Still, his third voyage changed history. He had taken the Europeans all the way to a new continent, South America. No longer the governor, Columbus convinced Ferdinand and Isabella to let him sail as an explorer for the crown once more. In 1502, he departed with 4 caravels and 140 men. His 13-year-old son Ferdinand came too, and he recorded the journey in detail. The mission, to find a strait through the Indies that would lead directly to the riches of Asia. The voyage would begin with a very bad omen. He was forbidden to land in Hispaniola, so Columbus anchored offshore to warn Governor Ovando of a coming storm. Ovando ignored him and sent a treasure fleet of 28 ships to Spain, and within days a hurricane struck. Nearly the entire convoy was destroyed, drowning hundreds and sending tons of gold to the seabed. Columbus's 4 ships survived, and he saw this as divine will. But what followed was a nightmare of storms. For 88 days, Columbus's fleet was hammered by wind and waves. He later wrote that the sea boiled like a cauldron, the sky blazed like fire, and rain fell as though the world was drowning in a second flood. After experiencing a brief relief from the storms off the coast of Honduras in 1502, Columbus encountered a massive Maya trading canoe, the first European contact with the Mesoamerican world. He seized the chief trader and his family to eventually take back to Spain. He then turned south and faced the worst weather yet. In addition to these various terrors, another danger appeared. It was a waterspout that on Tuesday, December 13th, passed right among the ships. If we had not dissolved it by reciting the Gospel of St. John, there is no doubt that it would have swamped whatever it struck. The water was lifted in a column right up to the clouds, a column thicker than a barrel, twisting like a whirlwind. After facing such contrary winds and seas, with the fleet practically dismembered and the crews on the point of exhaustion, we finally experienced a day or two of quiet seas. During this period, however, the ships were surrounded by sharks, which struck fear into all, but especially into the doomsayers. For just as they say vultures can find a dead body by its smell from very far away, some thought the sharks shared this power. We slaughtered many of these sharks, catching them with a hook and chain until we finally could kill no more. Although some took these sharks as a bad omen and others just as bad fish, everybody did them the honor of eating them. So short were we of food for having spent 8 months at sea and having consumed all the meat and fish we had carried from Spain. Moreover, with the heat and the dampness, the biscuits were so full of maggots that, with God as my witness, I saw many men who refused to eat their porridge until nightfall so as not to see them. Columbus would then anchor off of Panama, where he found gold that was abundant in the soil. The Spaniards would create a settlement here, but relations with the local chief would collapse into violence. Broken and exhausted, Columbus drifted again until disaster struck. In 1503, his caravels had been eaten down by worms, finally disintegrated on the coast of Jamaica. They would be stranded there for a year, surviving by the grace of the Taínos people, who Columbus would impress by predicting a lunar eclipse. His son Ferdinand would document this. The admiral remembered that in 3 days' time, just after dark, there would be an eclipse of the moon. He therefore sent an Indian we had with us from Hispaniola to summon the ranking Indians of the region, inviting them to a feast where he wished to speak with them. Arriving during the daytime, before the eclipse was to occur, the caciques were told through their interpreter that we were Christians, which meant that we believed in a God who dwelt in the heavens and whom we served. This God took care of people and punished the wicked. He told them that as God had seen that the lack of interest the Indians had in trading with the Christians for food had him very angry, and he planned to send them a great famine. Since they obviously did not believe him, however, he would give them a sign from the heavens. If they paid close attention to the moon tonight, he said, they would see it rise angry and swollen, but when the moon rose, they paid close attention. Since the higher it rose, the darker it became, as the blackness crept over it. So astonished and frightened were they that they hurried toward the ships from every side, begging the admiral to ask God not to send his wrath upon them, promising that they would in the future bring everything that the Spaniards required. To this the admiral replied that he would have to take counsel with God, and he secreted himself to his cabin as the moon darkened further, with the Indians crying out for his help. When the admiral saw that the eclipse would soon end and the moon brighten, he came out and explained that he had spoken with his God, offering petitions on their behalf, and that he had promised in their name that they would be good in the future and bring the Christians whatever food and other items they required. God had pardoned them, said the admiral, and as a sign of his pardon, the moon would now lose its angry swelling. When the Indians saw that this in fact was occurring, they thanked the admiral profusely and sang the praises of his God. They carried on with this until the eclipse had passed. From then on, they took great care to provide us with whatever we needed, praising the Christian God unceasingly. They were stranded for a year now, and Columbus's secretary, Diego Mendez, risked a canoe voyage to Hispaniola to fetch rescue. And in 1504, Columbus returned to Spain for the last time. He had not found the strait to Asia. He had not established a lasting colony. But he had sailed the coast of Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama, proving that the Caribbean was bounded by vast new continents, although he didn't necessarily know that yet. Gold was now being mined in abundance in Santo Domingo, and the discovery of it elsewhere confirmed there was plenty of it to be found. By 1506, the man that had crossed the ocean 4 different times was now a shadow of himself. He returned to Spain sick and nearly blind. Christopher Columbus would live out the last of his days in Valladolid, petitioning in vain for the wealth and titles he believed he was due. I myself have profited little from the 20 years of laborious and dangerous service. Today in Castile, I have no roof over my head. If I need a meal or a bed, I must go to an inn or a tavern, and I frequently have no money with which to pay the bill. He died on May 20th, 1506, at just 55 years old, penniless, embittered, and still convinced that he had reached Asia.